3 weeks after this moment, the man who laughed in her face will remove his hat on this very road and beg forgiveness. So it seems this is the Whitfield girl.
Indeed I am, sir.
A shilling, I hear, for 93 ewes and a ram. A lord has robbed a beggar, and the beggar thanked him for it. Rare that a morning gives you a joke that good.
I hear your father died owing a debt he never once dared tell his own daughter about.
3 weeks, and that mangy flock will be dead in the field, and you'll be right back where you started, hey, empty-handed, same as the day you crawled into this village.
Keep that laugh close, Squire Harding, because in 3 weeks' time, you will need it far more than I ever will.
But to understand why Squire Harding would one day bow his head on this very road toads, we must...
Ravensmoor Hollow, Spring 1856. The rain did not fall that morning. It hung, thick and grey and patient, the way grief hangs over a house long after the funeral is done. Eleanor Whitfield walked into it anyway. 23 years old. Boots split at the seam. A shawl gone the color of wet slate. She had been walking since dawn, and her legs had stopped complaining somewhere around the 2nd mile. Because the body only fights you for so long before it gives up and simply does the thing. She did not look back at the cart. The driver had gone on ahead with the last of what she owned. A tin box of thimbles. A chipped blue jug that had belonged to her mother, and before her mother to a grandmother had never met and now never would. She let him go on without her. She wanted the last mile alone. She wanted her face composed before anyone in Ravensmoor saw it. 6 months since the funeral. 4 since the landlord in Ashcombe had turned her out over debts. Her father had never told her he owed. 2 since she had written to a cousin she barely remembered and received in return a single line. There is a room, come if you must, she must. There had been nowhere. That was the truth of it. Plain flat. The kind of truth that does not need decorating. When a person has nowhere else, the word must stops being a choice and starts being a fact. Like weather. Like the rain that would not fall and would not stop hanging over her either. The lane climbed between hedgerows heavy with hawthorn, and the smell, wet blackthorn, sharp and green, hit her so hard, so sudden, that she had to stop walking. Because it was the same smell. The exact same smell as the morning they buried her father. She had not expected a hedge to remember something her own mind kept trying to forget. She pressed her palm flat against a stone wall until it passed. It passed. Everything passes, her father used to say. Which had sounded like comfort when she was young and sounded like a threat now that she understood what it meant. A thrush called once from the thicket. The rain thinned to mist. And when she lifted her head, there was Ravensmoor Hollow laid out below her in the fold of the valley. Slate roofs. Thatch. One crooked chimney trailing smoke like a signal fire nobody had lit on purpose. And beyond the village the long grey rise of the Ravens' estate. Empty, no livestock she could see from here, just grass. Wind distance. She did not know yet what that emptiness meant, and she would. The cousin's cottage sat at the far end of the village, low, lime-washed. A green door swollen shut with damp, so that Eleanor had to put her shoulder into it twice before it gave way and fell into the front room. A woman rose slowly from a stool near the window. "You're thinner than your mother," wrote, the woman said. "Not hello, not welcome. Just an assessment delivered the way you'd note a crack in a wall." "I walked from the coach," Eleanor said. Because what else was there to say? Because that was the whole of the explanation, and she did not have strength left over to dress it up. "There's bread," the woman said. "Agnes." Her name was Agnes, Eleanor had to remind herself.
Eleanor sat.
The bread was hard at the crust and soft in the middle, and she ate it slowly, the way you eat when you have learned, recently and bad, what it costs to go without. Agnes watched her the way you watch a stray dog on your step. Not unkind. Just waiting to see whether the thing would stay, or bolt or bite. Nothing more was said that first evening. In the loft above the kitchen there was a straw mattress and a folded blanket that smelled of lavender and mice. Mostly mice. Eleanor lay in the dark and listened to the rain begin again on the slates above her, tapping out some rhythm that meant nothing and would not stop meaning nothing. No matter how long she listened for a pattern in it, she had, in truth, arrived at the bottom of a long fall, which meant the only direction left was up, or at least not down. She would have settled for not down. She did not know that first night that the estate steward had spent the better part of a week asking around the taproom of the Fox and Crown. whether any soul in the parish might take a certain neglected flock off his master's hands. For the price of the pens they stood in, practically for nothing. She did not know it, but she would. By the end of the first week, Eleanor had walked the parish twice off herself for any honest labor going, because pride, she had learned, was a thing you could afford when you had bread in the larder. She did not have bread in the larder, so pride went out the wall along with everything else that no longer served her. She scoured a dairy floor for a shilling. She mended a fisherman's net for a bowl of stew that had gone cold by the time she got it home. And ate it anyway, cold. Standing at Agnes's hearth because sitting felt like admitting defeat. On the 8th morning, coming down past the Fox and Crown with her hands raw from lye soap, she heard 2 drovers laughing on the bench outside. "He'll pay a man to take them," one said. "Pay, mind you." "Half dead already," the other said. "Fleece this like felted rags. Ticks the size of currants on the worst of them. His lordship wants the pasture cleared before Michaelmas. Doesn't much care how." Eleanor stopped in the road, because something in her chest had gone very still. The way it goes still right before you do something you already know is either brilliant or catastrophic, and you will not find out which until it is far too late to change your mind. She had grown up on her uncle's small holding above Ashcombe, before the fever took him too. Because that was the year fever took everyone, it seemed. That was simply the year it was, and she knew sheep the way another girl might know her letters, fluently, without having to think about the knowing. She knew a ruined flock could be brought back. She also knew, and this part sat heavier, that no one in Ravensmoor Hollow would believe such a thing coming, for a thin young woman in a mended shawl who had walked into the village 6 days ago with a split boot and a dead father's debts on her back. She went that afternoon anyway, to the steward's office above the corn merchant's, because sitting on the knowledge and doing nothing had at once, in the whole of her life, solved a single problem. The steward's name was Josiah Kellerman. He was a narrow man with narrow hands and a way of looking at a ledger like it owed him money personally. Eleanor climbed the stair and stood in the doorway until he looked up. "I'll take them," she said. He laughed. "Once." "Sure." The way a man laughs when he thinks he's misheard, and is giving you the chance to correct yourself before he has to be embarrassed on your behalf.
"Take what, girl?"
"The flock, his lordship's ewes." He set down his pen slowly, the way you set down a thing you might need to pick back up in a hurry. "The ones no one will buy."
"Yes."
He named the number, 93 head and a ram's. 94 animals in all. He named a price so small it was barely a price. A shilling and a signature to make the transfer lawful. Formality dressed up as a bargain. He named the pens, too, which she would have to clear out within the fortnight. "You understand," he said. Slow now, deliberate. "The way you talk to someone you suspect does not fully grasp the situation, that these are not sound animals. I understand. There will be no allowance. No feed provided, no shepherd's cottage, I understand." He looked at her a long moment, long enough that Eleanor felt the weight of it settle somewhere behind her ribs. Then he drew a sheet of paper toward himself and dipped his pen, and asked her name. "Eleanor Whitfield," she said, and spelled it for him, letter by letter, because he asked her to, and because some part of her wanted the name written correctly. Wanted it to exist on paper in this village, as something more than a rumor walking down the lane. He wrote it. He pushed the paper across. She signed. The ink was thin. The nib scratched, and when she straightened, her hand was trembling, and she pressed it flat against her skirt so he would not see, because a trembling hand looked like doubt. And she could not afford at that moment to look like she doubted anything. By dusk the news was in every doorway. The Whitfield girl, that thin one, the cousin's charity case, 93 dying sheep and a ram, and no land of her own to put them on. Somewhere in the village a woman was laughing about it over her supper. Somewhere else a man was shaking his head like he'd seen this coming from the moment Eleanor first walked in. And somewhere quietly in a manor house on the hill, a man named Kellerman was writing a line in a private ledger that had nothing to do with sheep at all. Eleanor did not know that last part. Not yet. The mockery, once it started, did not stop. It simply changed shape. Out in the lane the next morning, two women at the pump straightened when she passed. One of them said, loud enough to be heard because being overheard was rather the point, that a shilling was a great sum to pay for a heap of carrion. A boy running a hoop stopped and stared like she'd grown a second head. At the smithy, the smith laid down his hammer and watched her go by without a word, which was, somehow, worse than a word would have been. A word you could answer. Silence just sat there judging. At the corner by the churchyard wall, a broad man in a good coat came out of the lychgate with a spaniel at his heel. Squire Harding. He had heard the news at breakfast and was pleased by it, in the particular way, Certain men are pleased when the world confirms something they had already decided to believe. He planted himself in the middle of the lane. Eleanor had to stop. "So you're the Whitfield girl," he said. "I am a shilling, I hear, for 93 ewes and a ram." He laughed, and the spaniel wagged its tail, delighted by a joke it did not understand. "A lord has robbed a beggar, and the beggar thanked him for—" "That's a rare morning's work, that is." Eleanor did not answer. Because she had been schooled. 6 months of grief will teach you this. 4 months of a landlord's cold civility will finish the lesson. A closed mouth cost less than any retort. Whatever she said he would use. Silence, at least. He had nothing to hold. She waited until he tired of the sound of his own voice. He stood aside. She went on down the lane without looking back, and if her jaw ached from being clenched that tightly for that long, well, that was simply the cost of the morning. She would pay worse before the week was out. She had almost reached the turning for the estate fields when she saw the old woman, sitting on a low bench against the sunny side of a cottage, wrapped in a dark shawl, a distaff in her lap and a bowl of unspun wool at her feet. Her hands moved without her eyes needing to watch them. Winifred, the village called her, had been a shepherd's wife once, so people said, though her husband had been in the ground longer than most of the village had been alive. Eleanor slowed. Winifred lifted her chin without stopping the turn of her fingers. "Come here, girl." Eleanor came. The old woman looked at her a long moment. Long enough that Eleanor had to resist the urge to fill the silence with something. Anything the way she'd wanted to fill it with Squire Harding not 10 minutes before. She held her tongue this time too. Winifred reached into the bowl, took out a small pinch of raw wool, held it up between finger and thumb, so the afternoon light passed through it. "There is more in a beast," she said, "than what's been done to it." Eleanor waited for more. None came. Winifred lowered her hand and returned to the wheel of her fingers, and after a moment Eleanor understood she had been dismissed. She said thank you, though she wasn't entirely sure what for, and walked on. The words followed her down the lane the way a hand might rest lightly on a shoulder. She did not yet know what they weighed. She would. Beyond the last cottage, the land opened out into the estate grazing, and here the wind came straight off the moor, carrying last night's rain still in it, sharp and cold against her face. The pen stood a half-mile out, at the low end of a long grey slope, and even from that distance she could see the dark uneven shape of the flock inside them, packed close together, as though the hurdles were the only thing holding them upright, and not by very much. A pair of rooks lifted off a fence post as she came near. The sky above was the flat pale color of skimmed milk. She walked with her hands buried in the folds of her shawl and did not hurry, because she wanted her first look to be honest, because she wanted her legs steady under her when she finally reached the rail. The pens were worse than the drovers had said. The hurdles leaned. The straw underfoot had gone to black slurry. The trough was cracked clean across its length, and what water stood in it wore a skin of green scum on top, like something too long in a forgotten cellar. And the animals. Eleanor set her hand on the top rail and made herself look, really look, at each one. Ewes with hip bones sharp as tent poles, fleeces matted into slabs that hung from their sides in filthy plaits, so thick with tag and burr that the shape of the animal underneath was nearly lost beneath it. One stood on 3 legs, favoring the fourth like it had forgotten how to trust it. Another had a milky film clouding the near eye. The ram stood off in a corner by himself watching her, not lifting his head. She stood a long while at that rail. She did not weep, though her throat closed once hard, and she had to split down before it became something she couldn't take back. She counted them 90 ewes exactly as Kellerman had said. And the ram, besides. 94 in all. He had not shorted her by so much as a lamb. Small comfort that she marked in her mind which ones were worst. She listened to the sound of them, not the low peaceful murmuring of a healthy fold, but a wet laboring breath coming from too many mouths at once, like a room full of people all fighting off the same fever. The village was right then. The drovers were right. Kellerman had told her plainly, and she had understood him plainly. And yet under all of it, beneath the stink and the sag and the ruin, was a thing Winifred had pinched between 2 fingers and held up to the light. Eleanor did not name it to herself yet. She only stood at the rail and let herself look. She did not go back to the cottage that night. She pulled her shawl tighter, set her back against the leeward side of the pens and sat down on the wet ground and stayed there. The wind moved over the moor in long low sighs. A star or two showed itself between ragged clouds, gone as soon as they came. The ewes settled, shifted again. After a long while one of them, small near the corner, the one with the worst of the tag matted into her flank, came to the hurdle and pressed her head against the wood a few feet from Eleanor's shoulder and stood there, breathing. Eleanor reached up without turning her head, laid 2 fingers against the matted wool at the ewe's neck. Under the felted crust, deep down, where her fingertips only just reached, was warmth. And beneath the warmth, something else, a softness, faint as a rumor that had no business being there in an animal so far gone. She kept her hand where it was until the ewe drifted away again. Then she drew her shawl over her head and slept as best she could with her back against the hurdles. All through the half-sleep of that long night she listened. To the wind. To the flock. To something underneath both of those things that she could not yet name. Dawn came gray and slow. Eleanor woke to the flock stirring and to a stiffness in her shoulders that felt honestly earned. As though she had already begun some work simply by staying the night. She stood, brushed the wet straw from her skirt, walked the perimeter of the pens in the pale early light. Frost had come thinly overnight, lying in the hoofprints and the tops of the leaning hurdles like a whitening of chalk dust. She counted the flock again, out of habit. Most 3 ewes, 1 ram. Nothing missing. It was as she came around the far side of the pen, where the hurdles butted up against an older set of posts sunk in the ground long before the current lord had ever run stock on this hill, that she saw the first thing that did not fit. On the weathered face of the corner post, low down, half swallowed by lichen, someone had cut a mark. With the point of a knife by the look of it. Not the estate's brand. Not the parish tally mark, 2 letters twined together. And beneath it, curling into its shape and more like a maker's signature than a shepherd's tally. And below the letters, so faint she had to crouch and rub the moss away with her thumb to see it at all, something more, not just a date. Lines, faint, scratched shallow, like whoever made them had been in a hurry, or hadn't wanted them found easily. She traced them with a fingertip. They did not read like a tally. They read like a shape, like a path. A little arrow, cut crooked into the wood, pointing off toward the northeast corner of the pen, where the old ground rose slightly before falling away toward a stand thorn trees at the edge of the estate boundary. Eleanor stayed crouched a long time. She did not know what to make of it. The mark belonged to no one she knew, and no one had told her these pens existed before Ravensmoor's men had thrown their hurdles up around them. She thought of the drover's laughing voice, fleece-like had felted rags. And she thought of the softness she'd felt in the dark the night before, beneath a ewe's matted crust. And she found, quite honestly, that she could not make the 2 thoughts sit together in the way the village had made them sit together. She rose. She let the moss fall back, mostly over the letters. Though she left the arrow uncovered, she did not tell herself what the mark meant, because she did not yet know, and her uncle had taught her, long before the fever, long before any of this, not to ask a thing to answer before it was ready to. She only fixed the place of it in her mind. Corner post, northeast side. Beneath the lichen. An arrow, pointing toward the thorn trees. Then she turned back to the flock and began the day's proper work. Which was, quite simple, the work of not letting one more of them die before nightfall. There was a moment, more than once that morning, when she thought of turning back a different way entirely. Of walking down into the village and telling Kellerman she had changed her mind, that the pens were his again. That she had been a fool to sign her name to something this far gone. Except every time the thought rose, another rose faster to meet it. Except she had felt that softness under her fingers in the dark. Except the small ewe had come to the hurdle and pressed her head against the wood as if she trusted that something better was coming. Except walking away now would mean walking away from the one thing, in 6 terrible months, that had made her feel like more than a debt someone else had left behind. So she did not turn back. She picked up the fork instead, and let the thinking settle itself into her hands, where it belonged. She walked into the village and knocked at the yard gate of Samuel Grigg. A wheelwright by trade, and more than that besides, the kind of man villages like this one quietly depended on and rarely thanked properly. He built and mended wheels. Yes, but a wheelwright's trade ran close beside the smith's, because iron tires had to be heated and shrunk onto wooden rims, and so his yard held a small forge alongside the sawhorse and the spoke lathe. And Samuel Grigg was as easy with a hammer and hot iron as he was with a draw knife and seasoned ash. Her mother had once written of him. An old friend of her uncle's from a life Eleanor barely remembered anymore. He met her at the gate with the plain, unsurprised warmth of a man who has already heard everything the parish has to say about someone, and has decided privately to set none of it against her. He said, before she'd even finished asking, a fork, a brush, stout as I've got, and rope. Yes. You'll want water carried too. I will. I'll bring some by cart at noon. That was the whole of it. No lecture. No warning about the folly of what she'd done. Just here is what you need, and here is when I will bring the rest of it. She was halfway back up the lane, arms full, when a low gray shape came out from beneath the hedge and fell into step behind her. An old sheepdog, thin along the ribs, one ear torn down to a stub, muzzle gone nearly white with age. It kept a careful 6 paces behind her and said nothing when she stopped and looked back at it. Samuel told her later, when she asked, that the dog had belonged to the last man to properly shepherd that flock, and had been left behind with the pens when that man went south. No one had thought, in all this time, to feed it. It had lived on what it could catch. It had a name once, he didn't remember it. Eleanor didn't try to give it a new one either. She simply walked on, and the dog walked on behind her, and by the time she reached the pens the 6 paces had shortened, without either of them remarking on it, to 4. She began with the trough, tipped it, scraped the green scum out with a shard of broken slate, rinsed it with the last of the clean rainwater standing in the hollow of a rock nearby, set it back in place. She forked the black slurry out from underfoot until she reached the packed earth beneath, and laid down fresh straw from the small stack. Samuel brought at noon, along with 3 buckets of water and a leather pail of oatmeal that he set down without a word, as though delivering supplies to a woman with 94 dying sheep were the most ordinary errand in the world. She did not speak more than a dozen words all day. Neither did he. By the middle of the afternoon she'd begun on the animals themselves. She took the worst ewe first, the one with the milky eye, and led her out to a smaller hurdle square she'd rebuilt else the leeward wall. Tied her gently, dipped the stout brush in a bucket of warmed water and began working at the felted plate on the ewe's flank. The matted crust came away in stiff dark scabs, taking tag and burr and dried filth with it. And beneath the plate, where no eye had reached in months, maybe long, the wool lay pale and springing and clean. Eleanor drew her fingers through it. It rose behind her hand like the nap of good cloth, fine cloth, the kind she'd seen once as a girl in a draper's shop window in Ashcombe and never once expected to touch with her own 2 hands, let alone find hiding underneath a heap of rag and ruin that a duke's own steward had called carrion without a second thought. She held a strand up to the low afternoon sun, the way Winifred had held up her pinch of wool the day before, and the light passed through it in a way she had never once seen light pass through the fleece of her uncle's flock, nor through any fleece she'd helped skirt at market as a girl, standing at her uncle's elbow, learning the trade one lesson at a time. She lowered her hand, she did not speak. The old sheepdog, lying now against the hurdle 3 feet from her boots, thumped its tail once against the straw, as if it too understood exactly what she'd just found, and had simply been waiting all this time for someone to notice. She worked until the light failed, got through 4 ewes that first proper day, and made a rough tally in her head of what each one had shown her, beneath the ruin. On the 3rd animal, high on the shoulder, where a shepherd would tie a marker, she found a scrap of colored thread still knotted into the wool, faded almost to white now, blue once, she thought. Finely spun. She cut it free with her small knife, put it in the pocket of her skirt without stopping the brush. That evening, walking down toward Agnes's cottage with the dog padding behind her and Samuel's empty pail swizzing from her hand, Eleanor didn't tell anyone what her fingers had learned that day. Not Agnes, who set out a bowl of broth and asked no questions, the way she'd asked no questions from the first evening. Not the vicar, who nodded to her in the lane as though she were already half a ghost. Someone he ought to be gentle with, because the worst had already happened and there was no sense making it worse. She kept the scrap of blue thread folded in her palm through supper. Opened her hand again only once she was alone in the loft. Held it up to the tallow flame until the wick guttered low and she had to lay it aside and sleep, because there was no more light left to hold it by. She rose before the bell in the parish struck 5. The frost had thickened overnight, and the ground behind the cottage rang faintly under her boots as she crossed it. The dog was already waiting at the gate, as though it had been posted there, as though it too had somewhere to be. Together they walked the lane up to the pens in a gray light that had no color in it yet at all. Eleanor did not go straight to the ewes. She went first to the corner post, knelt where the lichen still half hid the twined letters and the crooked, scratched arrow beneath them. Traced the shapes again with the tip of her finger, CR. And under it, that arrow, pointing northeast, toward the thorn trees. She looked at the ground around the base of the post. The soil there was harder than the rest of the pen, trodden flat, and then left. Forgotten, Eleanor took Samuel's fork and worked at it carefully so as not to split the old wood of the post itself. 2 spade depths in, the tine struck something that was not stone. She set the fork aside, knelt again, worked with her bare hands now, brushing the cold damp soil back with her fingers until a tin box, no larger than the loaf her mother used to bake on a Saturday, the lid rust-sealed along the seam, so tight it looked fused shut like the earth itself had decided this was not meant to be found. She carried it into the shelter of the leeward hurdles and sat with it across her knees. The dog lay down against her hip, warm and solid and entirely unbothered, as though tin boxes turned up out of frozen ground were simply the ordinary business of a morning. She worked the lid loose with the flat blade of her knife. It lifted, at last, with a small sigh. As though the box itself had been holding its breath for 20 years, waiting inside, wrapped in oilskin gone dark and stiff with age, lay a book, bound in soft brown leather, the corners worn pale and round with handling. She unfolded the oilskin, one edge at a time, the way you'd unwrap something you already suspected might break in your hands if you rushed it. On the flyleaf, in a slant, patient hand, was written a name. Caleb Renshaw, shepherd to this ground, and beneath it a year 1816. Eleanor sat very still, because those were the letters CR, the same two letters twined together on the corner post not 30 feet from where she now sat. And the arrow, she understood it now, or thought she did, had not been pointing to treasure exactly. It had been pointing to him. To whatever this man had left behind, buried under his own mark, as though he'd wanted someone someday to come looking. She turned the pages slowly. Each one held a column of ewes, numbered and named, sires and dams recorded beside them, and beside those a short note on the fleece of the lamb each pairing had thrown, coarse or fair, long in the staple or short, whether the crimp held true across the whole of the fleece or only in patches. Some entries were bracketed, marked with a small careful star drawn in the margin. Beside one such stars, in a firmer stroke than the rest, as though the man had pressed harder because the words mattered more, someone had written, "Finest any down or Lincoln I have handled in 20 years on this ground." Eleanor sat with the book open on her knees for a long time. She did not weep. She turned the pages instead. Matched in her mind, the starred entries against the 4 ewes she had already cleaned and brushed the day before. The pattern was there, plain as anything. A man had spent 20 years, beginning the very year the flyleaf declared, patiently, mating by mating, teaching this ground what it could become. And somewhere near the back of the book the entries simply stopped. Mid-line, no closing word. No final entry marked the way a man marks the end of a season's work, just silence where a sentence should have finished. She turned to that last written page and found only a pressed sprig of heather, gone brown as old iron, and a single tuft of pale wool tied off with a scrap of blue thread, the exact twin of the one already folded in her pocket. She closed the book, wrapped it back in the oilskin, placed it in the tin, and the tin she carried inside her shawl, pressed close against her ribs, the way you'd carry something you were not yet ready to explain to anyone. She stood in the pen, 93 ewes and a ram moving slowly around her in the thin morning light, and looked at them properly. At last, the way Winifred had told her to look. There is more in a beast than what's been done to it. She did not yet know what had happened to Caleb Renshaw. She did not know that the entries stopped, not because a man had simply moved on to other work, the way men sometimes do. She did not know that somewhere in this same parish, a boy of 18, a boy who would grow into a broad, quiet, careful man named Samuel Grigg, had once worked these same fields under this same shepherd's instruction, and had never, not once in 20 years, spoken aloud what he suspected about the manner of that shepherd's disappearing. She did not know that Josiah Kellerman's father had held the steward's position before him. She did not know that somewhere in the estate house on the hill, in a locked drawer that had not been opened in longer than Eleanor had been alive, there existed a second ledger, one that did not match the figures Kellerman reported each quarter to his lordship. One that, if it were ever found and read side by side with the honest record, would tell a very different story than the one the parish believed about a flock too far gone to save. She knew none of it yet. She only knew that a man named Caleb Renshaw had spent 20 years of his life building something extraordinary out of ordinary animals. That he had marked his work with a secret sign, low on a fence post, where only someone willing to kneel in the mud and look closely would ever find it. And that his record stopped mid-sentence with no explanation and a scrap of blue thread pressed between the pages like a held breath. She turned back to the flock and began the day's proper work. Word of the bargain had already thickened by then into something the village found almost pleasant to repeat. Eleanor felt it every time she walked the lane. In the way conversations paused, just slightly, when she came into view, and resumed, just slightly louder, once she'd passed. In the way children were nudged and told, in whispers not nearly quiet enough, "There's the one who bought the dying sheep." In the way Squire Harding tipped his hat to her now with an exaggerated little flourish that was not courtesy at all, but its opposite, dressed up to look almost like manners. She said nothing to any of it. Because a closed mouth cost less. Because she had 94 animals depending on her not wasting a single hour of daylight on people who had already made up their minds. Because in this part she did not say aloud to anyone, not even to herself except in the deepest part of the night, when the wind moved over the moor and the dog's breathing was the only steady thing in the dark. Because she had found something. Under the ruin. Under the rags and the tag and the filth the drovers had laughed about outside the Fox and Crown. She had found a man's whole life's work, buried and waiting. And whatever had happened to Caleb Renshaw, whatever had cut his record off midline 20 years ago, with no word of farewell, she found, standing at that rail in the thin morning light with the tin box pressed against her ribs, that she could not simply let it lie forgotten in the ground beside him. Not now that she'd found it. Not now that she knew. There was a night somewhere in that second week when Eleanor almost gave it up, not the flock, never the flock, but the fight to hold her head high while doing it. She had come down from the pens later than usual, past full dark. Her hands cracked from the cold water and the lie and the endless brushing, and she had passed the Fox and Crown just as the door swung open and spilled lamplight and laughter out into the lane. And in that laughter unmistakably her own name. The Whitfield girl, sleeping with the sheep now is she, might as well marry one, the state of her hands. She had not stopped walking. She had made herself not stop walking. Because stopping would have meant they'd won something, some small ugly victory over her composure. And she was not, she told herself, going to give them that. Not tonight. Not any night. But she had cried anyway quietly. The kind of crying that doesn't announce itself. That just leaks out the corners of your eyes while your face stays perfectly still. Because you have trained your face, over 6 hard months, to stay still no matter what your chest is doing. She reached Agnes's cottage and did not go in. She sat instead on the cold stone step outside, in the dark, and let herself feel, just for a few minutes, how tired she was. Not tired from the work she could carry. Tired from being looked at. Tired from being a story other people told about her instead of a person. The door opened behind her. Agnes did not ask what was wrong. She simply sat down on the step beside her, in her nightdress, in the cold, and said nothing at all for a long while. "My mother wrote that you were kind," Eleanor said finally. "Before I came, I didn't believe her. I thought kind was just a word people used for cousins they didn't know how else to describe. Your mother, Agnes, was kinder than she had any right to be, given what life handed her. I expect she saw something of herself in you writing." She was quiet a moment. "I am not a demonstrative woman, girl.
Never have been.
But I'll tell you this once, and then we'll not speak of it again unless you raise it. You are not a charity case in this house. You never were. You are the only family I have left above ground, and I would rather lose every stick of furniture I own than lose the chance to know you properly." Eleanor did not trust her voice enough to answer. Agnes patted her knee once, awkwardly, the way a person pats something they are not accustomed to touching gently, and rose and went back inside and left the door standing open behind her so the firelight would spill out onto the step. Eleanor sat a while longer in that spill of warm light. Then she went in and banked the fire and climbed the ladder to the loft, and slept better that night than she had in a very long while. That evening, Josiah Kellerman sat alone in the estate office above the corn merchant's, the ledger open before him, and did something he had not done in longer than he cared to remember. He hesitated. Because word had reached him too, the way word reaches everyone in a village small enough that nothing stays private for more than a day. The Whitfield girl. Working from dawn until the light failed. Not giving up, the way he'd assumed, the way everyone had assumed, she would within the week. He dipped his pen, held it above the page, and then set it down again without writing anything at all, which was in its own quiet way the first sign that something in Ravensmoor Hollow had already begun to change, whether Josiah Kellerman was ready for it or not. 3 days. That was how long it took Eleanor Whitfield to understand that she was not simply cleaning sheep. She was uncovering something. And there is a difference between those two things. A difference she felt in her hands before she ever let herself say it out loud. Because cleaning is a task, you finish it. You move to the next. Uncovering is different. Uncovering doesn't end when your hands stop moving. It keeps going in your head, long after the light fails. Long after you've climbed the ladder to the loft and pulled the blanket up to your chin. It keeps asking you questions you don't have answers for yet. She lay in the dark that third night and counted in her mind the ewes she'd finished. 11 out of 93. Which meant 82 more mornings like this one. 82 more afternoons of brush and warm water, and the slow patient work of finding out what was underneath. She should have felt daunted by that number. She didn't. Which surprised her more than anything else that had happened since she signed her name in Kellerman's office. Because 2 weeks ago she had been a woman with nothing. No home. No trade. No standing. And now she lay in a borrowed loft with mouse-scented blankets, counting sheep like a child too excited for sleep. And something in her chest that had been clenched tight since her father's funeral had, without her quite noticing when, begun to loosen. Not gone on? Just loosened a little. Enough to breathe around. She was at the pens, before the frost had finished silvering the grass the next morning. The dog already waiting at the gate the way it always was now, as though it had appointed itself to the job and would not be talked out of it. Samuel Grigg came up the lane an hour later with his cart, and this time he didn't stop at the gate. He came all the way in. Set down a second brush, longer handled, better suited to the job than the one he'd lent her first, and a length of new rope, and, without being asked, began forking clean straw into the far corner where the weakest ewes had taken to huddling. "You didn't need to," Eleanor said. "No," Samuel agreed, not looking up. "Didn't." That was the whole conversation she had learned in the short time she'd known him, that Samuel Grigg spoke the way some men prayed, sparingly, only when the words were load-bearing. Everything else, he let his hands say for him, and his hands, she was coming to understand, said quite a lot. They worked in silence for the better part of an hour. Until Eleanor, kneeling beside a ewe with a foot gone soft and foul at the base, glanced up and pinged the flock, not her the flock. His jaw set in a way she hadn't seen before. "You've been quiet," she said. "Quieter than quiet, I mean." "There's a difference." Samuel didn't answer right away, which for a man who didn't waste words was itself an answer. "I worked this ground once," he said finally. Eleanor sat back on her heels. "Here? These pens?" Before they were pens. He looked toward the corner post, the one with the lichen-covered letters, though Eleanor hadn't told him about that yet. Hadn't told anyone. Before the hurdles went up, there was a man kept this flock then. Kept it proper, kept it the way a man keeps something he loves, not something he's paid to mind. Eleanor's whole body lay still. "What was his name?" Samuel's eyes came back to her, held there a moment. And something crossed his face, quick, gone almost before she caught it, that looked, for all the world, like a door being shut on purpose. "Long time back," he said again, as though that answered the question. It didn't. But Eleanor had learned enough about Samuel Grigg in a handful of days to know that pushing him was like pushing a stone wall. You didn't move the wall, you just bruised your shoulder. So she let it sit. Filed it away next to the tin box, next to the arrow scratched into the post, next to the name written on the flyleaf in a slanted, careful hand. "Caleb Renshaw," he asked. "Just not today." By the end of the first week, 23 ewes had been cleaned, brushed, checked over foot and flank and eye, and set apart from the worst of the flock into a smaller enclosure Samuel had helped her rebuild out of salvaged hurdles. And the difference between the two groups had become by then impossible to miss. The cleaned ewes stood differently, ate differently. There was a kind of animal dignity returning to them, day by day, that Eleanor found she could not put into words, even though she felt it plainly enough in her chest every single morning when she came up the lane and saw them grazing quiet in the pale early light. She had begun, without quite deciding to, keeping her own record, a cheap notebook, bought with 2 of her hard-earned pence from the stationer in the village, because writing things down had always been her uncle's way, and her uncle's way had never once let her down. She wrote the tally of each ewe, the condition of the fleece beneath the ruin, whether the crimp held true, and more, as the week went on, she found herself matching her own fresh notes against the yellowed pages of Caleb Renshaw's book. The starred ewes, the ones he'd marked finest any Down or Lincoln I have handled, were without exception the ones producing the finest wool now 20 years on, their bloodlines diluted by neglect and hard years but not erased. Not entirely. Whatever Caleb Renshaw had built into this flock, patiently, mating by mating year by year, had proven stubborn to survive 20 years of ruin. It had waited. The way the tin box had waited under the frozen ground. The way, Eleanor was beginning to suspect, quite a lot of things in Ravensmoor Hollow had been waiting. For someone willing to kneel in the mud and look closely enough to find them. The wool factor's name when he finally came was Mr. Pruitt, down from Bradford on business unrelated to Eleanor entirely, passing through on his way to a larger stew purchase over, except a drove on the road had mentioned, offhand, a young woman up at Ravensmoor clearing sick sheep, and something about the way the drover said, it made Pruitt curious enough to turn his cart a mile out of his way. He did not expect to find what he found. Eleanor watched his face when she led him into the shed, watched the polite, faintly bored expression he'd worn, walking up the lane dissolve, piece by piece as she unfolded the first cleaned fleece across the scrubbed plank table and let him take it in his own 2 hands. He didn't speak for a long moment. He turned the fleece over, ran his thumb along the staple, held a lock of it up to the shed's dim light, the exact way Winifred had held up her pinch of wool on the bench outside her cottage. As if every person who understood wool truly understood it, learned that same gesture somewhere along the way, passed hand to hand like a secret. To where, he said finally, did this flock come from? The Ravensmoor estate, Eleanor said. His lordship's steward sold them off. 93 ewes and a ram for a shilling. Pruitt looked up at her. A shilling, he repeated, as though the word itself tasted strange in his mouth. A shilling. He looked back down at the fleece in his hands, and something in his expression, Eleanor would think about this moment often, in the weeks that followed, something in his expression looked almost like grief, as though he were holding proof of a mistake so large, made by so many people over so long a time, that there was no way to be angry about it properly. You could only stand there and feel the size of it, Miss Whitfield, he said. I have bought wool for 11 years. I have handled Lincoln long wool, Cotswold, the best of the down breeds this country produces. I have once held a fleece with the crimp this even, staple this fine. Do you understand what I'm telling you? No, Eleanor admitted, not fully. I'm telling you, Pruitt said, that whoever bred this flock, and I don't care how long ago it was done, was doing something very few men in England have ever managed to do, and someone let it rot in a field. Eleanor said nothing, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't have broken something in her voice. Pruitt bought what she had ready. Not all of it. She wouldn't have the full clip until shearing, and shearing was still weeks off, but a sample lot, cleaned and skirted and rolled, enough to prove to his masters in Bradford that the strange rumor from a Yorkshire moor parish was not in fact a rumor at all. He paid a deposit, in coin, counted out into Eleanor's raw chapped hands with a formality that made the whole exchange feel, for one strange moment, like a small and private ceremony. I'll send a cart, he said, within the fortnight. For the rest, once you've sheared. Thank you. Don't thank me. He was already climbing back into his own cart, but he paused, one boot on the steps, and looked back at her. Thank whoever bred these animals. I'd like to know his name someday, if you ever learn it. Eleanor's hand went, without her quite deciding it should, to the front of her shawl, where the tin box sat, close at every single day since she'd pulled it out of the frozen ground. Caleb Renshaw, she said. Pruitt know the name? She asked. Nope, he said slowly. Too slowly. No, I don't believe I do. But something in the way he said it made Eleanor doubt that was entirely true. Shearing, when it finally came in late spring, took the better part of 11 days. Eleanor had never done a clip this size alone, and she did not in the end do it alone. Word had gone round by then, not the mocking word of the first weeks but a different kind of word entirely, and on the 3rd morning of shearing she came up the lane to find 2 of the tenant farmers from the far side of the parish waiting at the pens with their own shears wrapped in oiled cloth, offering their hands for a fair day's wage and, more than that, offering something that looked unmistakably like respect. She did not turn them away. She could not have finished the clip in time without them, and pride, she reminded herself once again, was a thing you could only afford when you had bread in the larder. She had bread now. But she had also learned these past weeks that refusing good help out of stubbornness was its own kind of poverty. Work itself was brutal and rhythmic and in its own strange way peaceful. Catch the ewe, turn her gently onto her haunches, the old trick her uncle had taught her, so the animal went still and calm against your knee instead of fighting. Run the shears close along the skin, following the lay of the fleece, keeping the blade steady so the wool came away in one long unbroken blanket instead of torn and second-rate scraps. She learned to read each ewe's temperament in the first few seconds of contact, learned which ones needed a low, steady voice the whole time and which ones simply wanted to be handled quickly and let go. The dog lay at the gate of the shearing pen the entire 11 days, not once straying, as though he understood that this, more than anything else Eleanor had done since she arrived, was the culmination of the work. By the 5th day her hands had gone past aching into a kind of numb mechanical competence that let her keep going long after her body would ordinarily have quit. By the 8th day, Samuel had built a proper skirting table out of salvaged planks, wide enough for 3 people to work a fleece at once, pulling away the dirty edges and belly wool before rolling the good clean fleece into a neat tight bundle for the shed. By the 11th day, the last ewe stood shorn and released back into the pen, blinking and lighter and somehow younger looking, the way every sheared animal looks for the first startled hour after the fleece comes off. And Eleanor stood at the center of the empty shearing pen with wool dust in her hair, and her whole body one long ache, and felt for the first time since her father's funeral, something that was not merely relief. It was pride. Plain, unhurried pride. The kind that does not need anyone else's approval to feel true. 43 bales stood stacked in the shed by nightfall. More than she had dared hope for, given how far gone the flock had been only 2 months before. Edmund Caldwell owned the land east of the Ravensmoor estate and had for the better part of 15 years wanted more of it. He was not, by the standards of the parish, an unkind man. He paid his laborers fairly. He kept his fences mended and his ditches clear. If you had asked anyone in Ravensmoor Hollow to describe him, most would have used some version of the word solid. A man who did not raise his voice because he had never once needed, which was in its way the most dangerous kind of man there was. Because Edmund Caldwell got what he wanted not through noise, but through patience. Through the slow, quiet accumulation of small advantages, laid one on top of the other, until the thing he wanted simply arrived in his hands one day, and nobody could quite say how it had happened, only that it had. He stood now on the ridge above the Ravensmoor pens, a spyglass borrowed from his late father's city pressed to one eye, and watched a thin young woman in a mended shawl brush the flank of a ewe, while an old wheelwright forked straw nearby and a broken-eared dog lay sentinel in the mud. He had heard the rumor 3 days ago. From his own steward, who had heard it from a drover, who had heard it presumably from someone at the Fox and Crown, who had heard it from someone else entirely, the way all things traveled in a parish this size. Extraordinary wool. On the Ravensmoor flock, the one his lordship had all but given away. He had not believed it, he believed it now. Because he could see it even from here, even through a spyglass gone slightly foxed with age, the way the cleaned ewes carried themselves differently from the ragged ones still waiting their turn. The way the light caught their fleece and held there, pale and even, instead of scattering off the matted rags the way it should have. Edmund Caldwell lowered the spyglass, and began, in the unhurried, methodical way that had built his father's modest holding into something considerably larger over the course of one careful lifetime, to think he did not go to the pens himself. That would have shown his hand too early, and Edmund Caldwell did not show his hand early. He sent instead a note, polite, almost warm, inviting Miss Whitfield to take tea at Caldwell House, at her earliest convenience, to discuss a matter that might prove mutually beneficial. Eleanor read it twice. She had never been invited to tea by anyone in her life who owned a house with a name. Go, Agnes said, when Eleanor showed her the note over supper. Hear him out, costs you nothing to listen. It might cost me something, Eleanor said slowly, to be seen listening. Agnes set down her spoon. Girl, she said, you're already the talk of the parish. There's no version of this where you go unnoticed. Might as well be noticed sitting in Edmund Caldwell's good parlor with a proper cup in your hand, instead of noticed kneeling in sheepmuck every hour God sends. It was, Eleanor had to admit, sound advice. She went 2 days later, wore her one good dress, brushed and mended as best she could manage, and walked the 2 miles to Caldwell House, with her chin up and her hands for once clean. Caldwell House was not grand. Not in the way the Ravensmoor Manor was grand, with its long gravel drive and its ivy-choked east wing that nobody had lived in for 2 generations. It was solid, well-kept, a house built by a man who understood that comfort, properly maintained, outlasted display. Edmund Caldwell himself met her at the door. He was perhaps 45, broad through the shoulder without being heavy, gray beginning at the temples in a way that made him look, Eleanor thought, less like a man aging and more like a man who had simply been built to last, the gray only now catching up to confirm it. Miss Whitfield. He inclined his head. Not a beau exactly. Something more careful than that. Thank you for coming. Your note was kind. My note was self-interested, Caldwell said, with a small, dry smile that Eleanor had not expected. I find honesty saves time in the long run. Please, come in. The parlor was warm, a fire already laid and burning, though the day was mild enough not to need one, a small extravagance, Eleanor noted, meant to signal comfort rather than provide it. Tea was already set. A woman brought a plate of seed cake that Eleanor did not touch, because she had learned, in 6 months of hard lessons, not to eat in front of people until she understood exactly what they wanted from her. Caldwell poured, handed her a cup, sat across from her in a chair that had clearly been his father's, worn soft in the shape of a man's habitual sitting. I'll come to it directly, he said. I understand you've come into possession of the old Ravensmoor flock. I have, and I understand the wool is remarkable. It is. I'd like to buy them from you. Eleanor set her cup down very carefully in its saucer. They're not for sale. I haven't named a price yet. It won't matter, Eleanor said. They're not for sale. Caldwell studied her for a long moment, not unkindly. The way a man studies a ledger column that has not balanced the way he expected it to, trying to find the error before he starts over. May I ask why, he said. You bought them for a shilling, Miss Whitfield. I could offer you a sum that would set you up comfortably for the rest of your life. No more mucking pens in the cold. No more sleeping rough beside a hurdle fence, which I understand you've done more than once. You're well informed, it's a small parish. Eleanor turned her cup slowly on its saucer, buying herself a moment, because the honest answer, the whole, real answer, was tangled up with a tin box and a name written on a flyleaf and a promise she hadn't made out loud to anyone but had made. Same, kneeling in the mud beside a corner post 3 weeks ago. She gave him a smaller answer instead, true, just not complete. Because someone built something extraordinary out of that flock, she said. Over many years, and it was thrown away like it was nothing. I don't intend to be the second person to throw it away. Something shifted in Caldwell's face. Quick there and gone, someone, he repeated. You mean the previous shepherd? Eleanor's pulse ticked up. You know of him? Everyone of a certain age in this parish knew of him, Caldwell said, and his voice had gone carefully smooth in a way that made Eleanor's instincts prick up, sharp and sudden, the way they'd pricked up in Kellerman's office 3 weeks ago. Caleb Renshaw. Fine shepherd. Left before my own time managing this land, but I remember hearing the name spoken, growing up, never with much explanation attached to it. What happened to him? I couldn't say. Caldwell's tone did not change, but something in his eyes did, a flicker, gone almost before Eleanor caught it. The same flicker she'd seen cross Sanchal Singrig's face when she'd asked him the very same question. Men leave parishes for all sorts of reasons, Miss Whitfield. Debt, disgrace. A woman sometimes. It was a long said nothing. But she filed it away, next to the tin box, next to the arrow scratched into the corner post, next to the door she'd watched Samuel Grigg shut quietly on a question he hadn't wanted to answer. 2 men now who knew the name Caleb Renshaw, and did not care to say more than that. She would remember that. I'll leave the offer open, Caldwell said, as he walked her to the door. 20 minutes later, the tea gone cold and untouched in her cup, the seed cake likewise untouched on its plate. Should you change your mind, wool prices can be volatile, Miss Whitfield. A single bad seed, about a foot rot through the flock, a hard winter that costs you half your lambs. These things happen to the finest breeders in England. I'd hate to see you left holding nothing when I've offered you something substantial now. That's very generous of you, Eleanor said, to worry so much on my behalf. Caldwell's smile did not reach his eyes. I like to think I'm a practical man, he said.
Good day, Miss Whitfield.
She walked the 2 miles home with her chin up, and her hands once again curled into fists inside her shawl. Because something about that conversation had left a taste in her mouth she did not care for. Not the refusal, the way he'd said Caleb Renshaw's name. Smooth. Practiced. Like a man reciting a line he'd rehearsed rather than a memory he was reaching for honestly. She did not yet know why that mattered. She would. There is an arithmetic to grief that no one tells you about beforehand. You think, when it first arrives, that it will simply sit on your chest, forever, an unmoving weight, and that every morning will feel exactly like the morning of the funeral, world without end. It does not work that way. Eleanor was learning this slowly in fits and starts, the way you learn any hard truth. Grief does not leave, but it moves. It shifts its weight from your chest to shoulders, and then, on the better days further still, down into your hands, where at least it can be put to use. She thought of her father often in those weeks of brush and water and slow patient uncovering. Not with the raw breathless pain of the first months, but with something gentler now, something closer to company than to wound. She thought he would have liked the dog. She thought he would have stood exactly where Samuel stood, forking straw without being asked, saying little, letting his hands do the talking. She thought, on the mornings when the frost lay thick and silver across the pasture, and the whole world looked freshly made, that he would have understood, better than anyone else alive, exactly what she was doing out here. Because her father too had believed that ruined things were rarely as ruined as they looked. He had said so, more than once, about the small holding they'd lost, about the debts that swallowed it, about his own failing health in that last hard year. Everything passes, he'd told her. And she had thought it a small sad kind of comfort at the time. She understood it differently now, kneeling in a pasture that had once been a grave and a garden of neglect both at once, and was becoming slowly, under her own 2 hands, something else entirely. Everything passes. But not everything is lost in the passing. Some things simply wait to be found again by someone patient enough to look. Josiah Kellerman had not slept properly in 9 days. He told himself it was the season. Lambing troubles on 2 of the tenant farms, a dispute over a boundary hedge that had eaten most of the week in correspondence with the parish surveyor. The ordinary business of an estate steward's ordinary life, piling up the way it always did in spring. It was not the season, it was the drawer. The locked drawer in the estate office, second from the bottom, on the left-hand side of the desk his father had once sat behind. In this same room, doing this same work, for the better part of 30 years before Josiah had inherited both the position and the desk, and, though he had not understood this fully until he was well into his 30s himself, the drawer along with them. He had opened it only twice in the 11 years since his father's death, once the week after the funeral, out of some grim curiosity he had not been able to resist. And once 4 years ago, when a bad harvest had left him short on his own household accounts and he had told himself, in the particular way a man tells himself things he does not fully believe, that it was only a loan, that he would put it back. He had not put it back. He sat now at that same desk, the candle burned low, the state ledger, the honest one, this his lordship's man from London, reviewed twice yearly, opened before him and balanced as it always was to the penny. Because Josiah Kellerman was, in every way that showed, a careful and precise man. The second ledger sat in the locked drawer. Unopened tonight, he did not need to open it to know what it contained. 22 years' small careful discrepancies. A shilling skimmed here, from the sale of a lame ox no one thought to count too closely. A pound there, from wool receipts his father had learned and taught him in turn, could be adjusted by a small enough margin that no auditor from London would ever think to look twice. It had started with his father. Josiah had told himself that too, that it was his father's sin he'd merely inherited, the way he'd inherited the desk and the drawer, and that inheriting a thing was not the same as choosing it. He no longer entirely believed that either. Because when Caleb Renshaw had come to this same office, 20 years ago now, and laid a careful accounting of his own on this same desk, proof, plain and undeniable, that the wool receipts did not match the wool sold, year after year after year, Josiah's father had not denied it. He had simply asked the shepherd what he wanted. Josiah had been 19, working as his father's under clerk, learning the trade the way a son learns a trade from a father, which is to say by watching and in telling himself that whatever he saw must be ordinary, because his father was doing it and fathers did not do wrong things. He remembered the shepherd's answer. He had never forgotten it, not in 20 years, no matter how hard he'd tried. I want it to stop. Simple as that. Not a threat. Not a demand for silence money, which was what Josiah's father had clearly expected, judging by the way his face had gone from wary to something colder when the shepherd said it. Caleb Renshaw had not wanted money. He had wanted it to stop. And 3 weeks later, Caleb Renshaw had stopped appearing at the pens entirely, and his lordship's father, the old earl, dead now himself these many years, had been told the shepherd had left the parish suddenly, without notice, the way unreliable men sometimes did. Josiah had been 19. He had known even then, in the part of himself he did not like to visit, that this was not the truth. He had said nothing. He had gone on saying nothing for 20 years. And now he sat at his father's desk with a candle burning low and a young woman up at the old pens, turning a flock of ruined sheep into something the whole county was starting to talk about. And he understood, with the cold sinking clarity of a man watching a wave finally reach the shore he'd been dreading for 2 decades, that the ground beneath him had begun very quietly to shift. If the flock's true worth came fully to light, if buyers like Pruitt kept coming, kept talking, kept asking why such a flock had ever been sold off for a shilling in the first place, someone eventually would ask the obvious question. Why did a flock this valuable get thrown away as worthless? And the honest answer to that question led, in a straight line, back to a locked drawer, and a second ledger tashap to appearing at the pens 20 years ago, without notice, the way unreliable men sometimes did. Josiah Kellerman closed the sapin, blew out the candle and sat a long time in the dark, not sleeping, the way he had not properly slept in 9 days. It happened on a Tuesday. Or it was discovered on a Tuesday. Eleanor could never afterward pin down exactly when in the night it had happened, only that she'd gone to bed with the flock safely penned and woken, before dawn, to Samuel's fist hammering on Agnes's door hard enough to rattle the frame. Eleanor. His voice through the wood, tight in a way she'd never heard from him. Eleanor, get up now. She was down the ladder and out the door in her nightclothes, with her boots half laced before Agnes had even finished lighting a candle. The pens said, already turning back toward the lane, moving fast for a man his north hurdles down. Whole section of it. Someone's cut through. Eleanor's stomach dropped straight through the floor of her own body. How many are out? Don't know yet. Ran here the second I saw it. Came up early to start the milking cart, saw the gap from the ridge road they ran. Both of them, together, down the dark lane and up the rise toward the pens. the dog appearing from somewhere in the hedgerow to fall into pace beside them. And Eleanor's mind was already racing ahead of her feet, cataloging everything that could go wrong when 93 sheep and a ram, many of them still weak, still recovering, still not fully sound in wind or limb, got loose in the dark on unfamiliar ground. The road ran close enough to the estate boundary that a spooked ewe could find her way onto it easily as a spooked ewe on a dark road was one cartwheel away from disaster. The old quarry pit, half a mile east, fenced poorly if fenced at all. The river swollen with spring rain, running fast along the low edge of the parish. She reached the pens breathless, her lungs burning, and stood for one terrible, frozen second taking in what the gray pre-dawn light showed her. The north hurdle was down exactly as Samuel had said, not fallen, cut. She could see it even in the dim light, the clean, deliberate angle of a blade, through rope lashing that had held there far worse than a calm spring night. This was not an accident. She counted heads in the pen, fast, frantic. Losing count twice and starting over, the way you do when your hands are shaking too hard to trust your own arithmetic. 61 out of 94. 33 animals gone into the dark. Split up, Samuel said, already moving. I'll take the roadside. You know this flock better than any soul alive right now. You'll read their tracks better than me. Dog goes with you. Samuel. Go, Eleanor, she went. The old sheepdog moved ahead of her into the dark with a purpose that startled her. Nose down, working a centro across the wet grass with the quiet, focused competence of an animal remembering in its bones, a job it had been bred for generations to do and had simply been waiting all this time for someone to ask of it again. Eleanor followed. Through the wet grass, her thin nightdress soaked through within minutes, her bare ankles above her half-laced boots scratched raw by gorse, she couldn't see well enough to avoid. The sky had gone the color of a fresh bruise, that strange pre-dawn purple-gray that isn't quite night and isn't quite morning, and in that half-light every shape in the field looked for one heart-stopping second, like a lost ewe, before resolving itself into a rock, a bush, a fence post standing where it had always stood. She found the first three near the old quarry. Huddled together at the very lip of it, trembling, one of them, the small one, the one who'd pressed her head against this hurdle that first cold night weeks ago, standing so close to the drop that Eleanor's heart lodged itself somewhere in her throat, and stayed there the entire careful, silent approach it took to get a hand on the animal's wool and draw her back from the edge. She breathed, not sure if she was talking to the ewe or to herself. Easy, I've got you now. She got the three of them turned and moving back toward the pens, the dog circling wide to keep them from breaking apart again, and something in Eleanor's chest, fear, mostly, but something else too, something fierce and protective that she recognized distantly, as the same feeling she'd had standing at her father's graveside, the feeling of having exactly one thing left in the world worth fighting for, and being entirely unwilling to lose it without a fight. Something in her chest hardened into pure, focused will. She was not losing this flock. Not tonight, not to a cut rope and a coward's blade in the dark. Not after everything it had already cost her to save them once. It took until full daylight to find them all. Samuel found 19 along the road, herded into the shelter of a hedge by nothing more than sheer luck, and the fact that spooked sheep, left alone long enough, tend to bunch together rather than scatter further. 2 more had wandered onto Caldwell's land, and were found grazing, bizarrely calm, in the corner of one of his own fields, as though nothing at all unusual had happened to them in the night. The last one, the milky-eyed ewe, the very first one Eleanor had ever cleaned, the one whose fleece had first shown her what lay beneath the ruin, took until nearly noon to find she was in the river shallows, alive. Shivering violently, one foreleg cut and bleeding from a rock she must have stumbled against in the current, but alive, caught against a fallen branch that had, by some mercy Eleanor did not examine too closely for fear of unraveling entirely, kept her from being swept further downstream toward the deeper water. Eleanor waded in without a second's hesitation. The cold hit her like a physical blow, driving the breath clean out of her lungs, but she didn't stop. Got both arms around the ewe's trembling body and half carried, half dragged her back to the bank, and there, soaked through and shaking nearly as hard as the animal in her arms, she finally allowed herself to cry. Not for long, just long enough. Then she wiped her face with the back of one filthy, freezing hand, and got the ewe up onto unsteady legs and walked her home. They lost none of them. 33 animals, loose in the dark for the better part of 6 hours, on a night with a quarry pit and a road and a swollen river all within reach, and by the time the sun stood high over Ravensmoor Hollow, all 94 stood once more within the rebuilt hurdles, exhausted, shaken but whole. It felt, Eleanor thought, standing at the rail with her wet clothes finally starting to dry stiff against her skin, like a kind of miracle. It did not feel like an accident someone cut that rope, she said. Samuel stood beside her, his own clothes mud streaked to the knee, his face grim in a way she was coming to recognize as his particular brand of fury, quiet, contained, all the more unsettling for how little of it showed on the surface. You saw it too, that wasn't rot. That wasn't weather, that was a blade, I saw it. Who? Samuel? He was quiet a long moment. I couldn't say for certain, he said finally. But you have a thought, another silence, longer this time. There's a man came to see Caldwell's steward 3 days back, Samuel said slowly, as though each word had to be dragged out from somewhere he didn't much want to visit. Stranger to the parish. Kellerman's cousin, I heard, though I couldn't swear to it. Spent the better part of an afternoon up at the Ridge Road by the estate boundary. Man doing nothing in particular is usually a man doing something he doesn't want seen. Eleanor's blood went cold. Kellerman. I'm not accusing the steward outright, Samuel said. I've no proof of it. Just a feeling, and feelings aren't evidence, Mas Smash would hear. But you think it? Samuel looked at her. And for the first time since she'd met him, she saw something in his face crack open. Just slightly. Not the whole story. Not yet, but enough of it that she understood with sudden and complete certainty that Samuel Grigg knew far more about Josiah Kellerman, and about the family that had held the steward's position before him, than he had told her. I think, he said carefully, that some men in this parish have spent a long time keeping certain things buried, and I think a flock this valuable, coming up out of the ground the way it has, unsettles that burial considerably. He did not say Caleb Renshaw's name. He didn't need to. Eleanor felt the tin bar, still and always pressed close against her ribs beneath her shawl, and understood, with a certainty that settled into her bones like cold water, that whatever had truly happened to the shepherd who built this flock had not simply been a man leaving a parish quietly, without notice. Something else had happened. Something someone was still, 20 years later, working very hard to keep buried. She went to Winifred that same evening, still shaken, still cold clean through despite the fire Agnes had built up high in the hearth and the dry clothes she'd finally managed to change into. She found the old woman on her bench, as always, though the light had gone too dim by then for proper spinning, and Winifred sat instead with her hands folded in her lap, watching the last color drain out of the western sky the way some old people watch things end, with a kind of patient, unsurprised attention. You've had a hard day, girl, Winifred said, before Eleanor had said a word. How did you know? Whole parish knows by now. News like that doesn't stay quiet past breakfast, not in a place this size. Winifred patted the bench beside her and Eleanor sat grateful suddenly for the simple relief of not standing anymore. Someone cut your fence, someone did. And you've a thought about who? I've a thought, Eleanor admitted. I don't have proof. Winifred was quiet a long moment, her old eyes fixed on the darkening horizon. I knew Caleb Renshaw, she said finally. Eleanor's whole body went rigid. You knew him? I was younger then, my husband's was still living. We weren't close, mine. He kept himself mostly, up on that hill with his flock, the way solitary men. But I remember him. Quiet sort. Careful. The kind of man who noticed things other folk walked straight past without seeing. She paused. The kind of man who noticed things he oughtn't to have noticed, as it turned out. What happened to him, Winifred? The old woman turned to look at her directly. And in the last of the failing light, Eleanor saw something in that weathered face that looked unmistakably like fear. Old fear. 20 years old, carried quietly all this time. The way some fears are carried long after the thing that caused them has supposed falsat. I don't rightly know, Winifred said, which Eleanor did not entirely believe. One season he was there, tending that flock the way he always had, and the next he simply wasn't. Word went round he'd sudden debts, some said. A falling out with old Kellerman the father, some said that too, though never loud and never where the wrong ears might catch it. You think he's dead? The words came out of Eleanor before she'd fully decided to say them, blunt and terrible in the quiet evening air, and Winifred did not flinch from them the way Eleanor half expected her to. I think, the old woman said, very carefully, that a man does not build 20 years of careful, patient work into a flock of sheep and then simply walk away from it without a single word to anyone who knew him. Men who leave choose their moment. They say their goodbyes, even the poor ones. Even the debt-ridden ones say something. She shook her head slowly. Caleb Renshaw said nothing to anyone. He was simply gone. Eleanor sat with that in the deepening dark. You should be careful, girl, Winifred said after a while, her voice dropping lower. The way voices drop when the thing being said matters more than usual. Whatever's buried at those pens, and I think you know by now that something is. Some folk in this parish have spent 20 years making certain it stayed buried. A cut fence in the night is a warning. Warnings, in my experience, are what a careful man gives before he stops being careful. I'm not leaving, Eleanor said. I never thought you would. Winifred reached over, and in a gesture so unexpected that Eleanor felt her throat close up entirely, took Eleanor's raw work-scarred hand in her own frail papery one, and held it a moment. But you'll want to move carefully all the same. There's more at stake here than a flock of sheep, whatever the wool's worth. I think you've known that for some while now. I think that's why you haven't told a soul the whole of what you've found. Eleanor said nothing, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't have confirmed exactly what Winifred had already correctly guessed. The wind changed on a Thursday. It came up out of the northeast after supper, cold and sudden in a way that made Agnes go still at the hearth mid-motion, a stick of kindling forgotten in her hand. Snow, she said. Before anything else, Eleanor was already reaching for her boots. Because April storms on high pasture killed more sheep in a single bad night than a month of ordinary hard weather in the deep of January, and her uncle had taught her that lesson so many years ago that it had settled into her bones the way certain hard-won truths do, permanent and unshakable and immediate, the moment circumstances called for them. I'll come, Agnes said. You'll catch your death. I've caught worse than a spring storm in my time, girl. Get your shawl. They went together, the dog falling into step, the moment they reached the lane, and by the time they crested the rise toward the pens the first flakes had already begun. Wet and heavy, more slush than proper snow but dangerous all the same. The kind of storm that soaked a fleece through before it ever had the chance to turn to ice. And ice on a wet fleece was, Eleanor knew, one of the surest ways to lose an animal to the cold. Samuel arrived 20 minutes behind them, out of breath, a canvas sheet rolled under one arm that he'd begged, apparently straight out of his own workshop the moment he'd seen the sky turn. Lash it along the low corner, Eleanor called to him over the rising wind. Where the drift'll cut in worst he didn't argue. Didn't waste breath on unnecessary words the way he never did. Simply moved to do it, working fast in the failing light, and Eleanor found herself, not for the first time, deeply and quietly grateful for a man who understood that in a crisis, the most useful thing a person could offer was competent hands and a closed mouth. They worked for hours, dragging fresh straw against every gap in the hurdles, counting heads over and over, losing count in the driving snow and starting again, because losing a single animal to a miscount was not a risk any of them was willing to take. Eleanor thought once, briefly, fiercely, of the tin box still tucked safe and dry inside the shed, and found herself working harder for it, as though the storm were not merely a threat to 94 living animals, but a direct assault on everything Caleb Renshaw had spent 20 years building, and she would not, could not, let this night be the one that finally finished what someone else had started 20 years ago. Near 2 in the morning, above the shriek of the wind, she heard a child crying. She went to the lane with the storm lantern held high, its flame guttering wildly in the wind, and found in the ditch below the hedge, a woman on her knees in the wet snow with her arms wrapped tight around a boy of perhaps 4 years old. Behind them a cart lay tipped on its side, one wheel gone entirely. The mare that had drawn it stood shivering in her traces, eyes wide and white-rimmed with fear. "Please," said, the moment she saw Eleanor's light. "Please, my boy, you're not alone," Eleanor said, already moving, already unhitching the frightened mare with hands that had, over the past weeks, grown steady in exactly this kind of urgent, necessary work. "Not anymore. Come quickly now." The woman was a stranger to the parish. From the market town 2 valleys over, she managed to explain between chattering teeth, as Eleanor led them all up toward the pens. Her husband had gone ahead on foot for help, after the wheel struck a hidden stone in the dark and had not yet returned, and she had been afraid, so afraid, alone in the ditch with her boy in weather like this. Eleanor did not think long about what to do next. The cottage was too far. Agnes's hearth too small for what this woman and child needed right now, in this moment's cold, but the pens had shelter. Had the canvas Samuel had just finished lashing into, had straw and the warm close press of 94 living bodies on the other side of a hurdle wall. She settled the woman and boy into the sheltered corner, wrapped her own shawl around the trembling child despite Agnes's protest that she'd catch her own death doing it, and built a windbreak of straw and hurdle between the small family and the worst of the storm. Gave them the last of the bread from her pocket, the last of the clean water. Then, with the flock crowding warm and close on the other side of the hurdle from where the family now sheltered, she went back out into the weather. She walked the pen through the worst hours of that night. Twice she pulled a weaker ewe out from beneath another, that had gone down in the crush of bodies seeking warmth, before the weight of the flock above could do her any lasting harm. Once near 4 in the morning, in a corner of the pen she'd checked not 20 minutes before, she found a lamb. Not yet expected. Weeks early by any reasonable reckoning, born into the worst of the storm rather than the gentle warmth of a proper lambing shed. It lay half-born in the wet straw, small and blue and terribly, terribly still. Eleanor did not let herself thinking in that moment would have cost precious seconds she did not have to spare. She cleared the lamb's mouth and nose with one finger, quick and practiced from years of watching her uncle do exactly this on his own small holding, and began to rub the tiny body hard against its mother's flank, working warmth and motion into limbs gone slack and unresponsive. Nothing, she kept going, rubbed harder. Felt the cold, wet weight of the small body under her raw hands and absolutely refused, to let herself believe it was already too late. And then, a shudder, small, barely there at all, followed by a first ragged, furious breath. The lamb's enrapist finally came, thin and outraged and entirely gloriously alive, was, Eleanor thought afterward, one of the finest sounds she had ever heard in her whole. The dog, who had lain the entire night across the sleeping boy under the canvas, thumped its tail once against the straw, as though it too had been listening for exactly that sound and was satisfied now that the night's worst dangers had passed. By first light the wind had eased. The snow, patchy and wet and already beginning to melt off the backs of the huddled ewes, had done far less damage than it might have, and Eleanor stood at the rail with the small new lamb tucked warm inside the front of her coat and understood, with a kind of exhausted, aching clarity, that she had not lost a single animal. Not one, not even the milky-eyed ewe still favoring her injured leg from the river crossing days before, but standing. The woman from the ditch slept, finally, with her son curled safe inside her arms and the old sheepdog stretched protective across both their legs. The husband arrived at sunrise on a borrowed farm cart, having spent the whole terrible night searching frantically in the wrong direction. And when he saw his wife and son alive and warm under a canvas sheet a stranger had lashed against the storm for them, he did not manage a single word. He simply Eleanor stood at the hurdle, the newborn lamb still warm against her ribs where the tin box usually sat, and thought, without quite meaning to, of Caleb Renshaw, of 20 years of careful work, of a man who had built something extraordinary out of ordinary animals, and had been erased for it, one way or another, so completely that even his name made grown men look away. She would not let this ground forget him, whatever it cost her to make certain of that. She did not yet know how close that promise would soon bring her to the exact place, and the exact truth, that someone in this parish had spent 20 years so desperately trying to keep buried. It was 2 days after the storm, while repairing the last of the storm-damaged hurdle along the pen's northeast corner, that Eleanor found the second thing the ground had been hiding. She was working alone that afternoon, Samuel gone into the village for fresh timber, Agnes home tending the family Eleanor had sheltered through the storm, who had stayed on 2 extra days at her insistence while the husband arranged a new cartwheel. The dog lay nearby, dozing in a patch of thin spring sun, one ear twitching now and then at some sound only he could hear. The storm had done more than knock down hurdles, it had scoured the ground too. Washed away a season's worth of settled soil along the base of the old corner post, the very post where she'd first found the twined letters, the arrow, the tin box buried beneath. And now where the earth had washed thin, something new showed through, not another box wood, pale and old, half-rotted but unmistakably shaped by human hands rather than by chance. A section of old flooring, Eleanor realized slowly, kneeling to brush away the last of the loose soil. The remains of what must once have been a small shepherd's shelter, built directly against this same post, long since collapsed and buried and forgotten beneath 20 years of accumulated ground. Her hands had gone very still. She worked carefully now, slowly. The way you work when some instinct older and wiser than conscious thought warns you that whatever you are about to uncover matters more than anything you have found so far. The old flooring gave way easily under gentle pressure, rotted through by 2 decades of rain and frost. And beneath it, sat back on her heels, one hand pressed hard over her own mouth, and did not move for a very long time, bone unmistakably. A curve of it, pale against the dark earth, weathered by years but entirely, undeniably. She knelt there in the thin spring sunlight, the dog suddenly alert, and pressed close against her side as though he too understood the weight of what lay in the ground before them, and felt the whole of the past weeks, the arrow, the tin box, the careful evasions of Samuel and Winifred and Edmund Caldwell, the cut fence rope in the dark, settle into a single terrible undeniable shape. Caleb Renshaw had not left Ravensmoor Hollow 20 years ago. He had never left at all. He was here. He had been here the entire time, buried beneath his own shelter, beneath his own careful marks scratched into the corner post, close enough to his flock that Eleanor had slept with her back against these very hurdles for a dozen nights now, entirely unaware that she had been keeping vigil all along, beside the very man whose life's work she was fighting so hard to save. She did not move the earth further. She sat instead, very still, one hand resting flat against the cold ground, and made herself a promise every bit as solemn in its way as the signature she'd once pressed into Kellerman's ledger. Whoever had done this, however long they had kept it buried, however far their protection ran into whatever house on whatever hill in this parish, she would find out. And she would not let this ground keep its silence one single day longer than it took her to prove it. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a person in the moment they understand their whole life has just changed shape. Not the silence of shock exactly, though shock is part of it. Something closer to the silence of a held breath, the body waiting to find out whether it is safe to exhale. Eleanor knelt in that silence for a long time. Because this changed everything. Because a story about a ruined flock and a foolish girl who bought it was, she understood now, kneeling there with her hand still resting on disturbed earth, never the story at all. It had only ever been the cover of the story. The true one lay underneath, the way the fine wool had lain underneath the felted ruin, waiting for someone patient enough to brush the filth away and see what was really there. Which meant every kindness shown to her these past weeks had to be looked at again in a different light. Samuel's silences, Winifred's careful frightened warnings, even Caldwell's smooth rehearsed recitation of a name he claimed to barely remember, except none of them had lied to her outright. They had simply not told her the whole of it. And there is a particular kind of loneliness in realizing that everyone around you has been carrying a piece of the truth and setting it down just short of your feet, hoping you would find the rest yourself, because none of them had the courage to hand it to you directly. Eleanor did not touch the bone again. She covered it, gently. The way you'd cover a sleeping child you didn't want to wake, except this was not sleep and there would be no waking. And some part of her understood that the moment her fingers laid the first handful of soil back over that pale curve, she had crossed into a different story than the one she thought she'd been living. She had thought this was a story about sheep. It was not a story about sheep. The dog whined once, low in his throat, and pressed his head against her knee. As if to say, enough now. As if to say, you've found what you came for, stop digging. She did not stop, not the digging, the thinking. Because her mind had already started running, fast and cold, through every conversation of the past month, and every conversation she realized had been leading her here. To this exact patch of turned earth. To this exact terrible answer. Samuel's shut door of a face when she'd asked him Caleb Renshaw's name. Winifred's fear, old and careful, wrapped around every word she'd offered. Caldwell's smooth rehearsed recitation of a name he claimed barely to remember. Kellerman's ledger, Kellerman's silence. Kellerman's cut fence rope in the dark. Which meant, and here her thoughts snagged, hard, the way a coat snags on a nail, which meant she was not simply fighting a village's mockery anymore. She had never simply been fighting a village's mockery. She had been standing this whole time on top of a murder, and she had not known it. Except she had known it. Hadn't she? Some part of her had known it from the very first morning she'd knelt at that post and traced two letters twined together like a hand reaching for help 20 years too late to be answered. She sat back on her heels, breathed. Because panic would not serve her here. Panic never served anyone, her uncle used to say, except the man causing the trouble in the first place. Panic just did his work for him. So she would not panic, she would think, she told Samuel first. He came back from the village at dusk with a cartload of fresh timber, and found her sitting on an overturned bucket outside the shed, the dog's head heavy in her lap, her hands scrubbed clean, but her face gone pale in a way that stopped him mid-stride before he'd even climbed down from the cart. I found him, she said. Samuel went very still. Found you know who? The timber slid off the cart's edge and hit the ground with a crack neither of them flinched at. Samuel crossed the yard slowly, the way you cross towards something you've been dreading and hoping for in equal measure for 20 years, and stood over her. Where the northeast corner. Under the old shelter floor, the storm washed the ground thin. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that, distantly. The way you're proud of small things when the large things have gone entirely out of your control. There's bones, Samuel. I didn't dig further, I didn't want to. I didn't think it was right to disturb him more than the storm already had. Samuel closed his eyes. When he opened them again, something in his face had broken open completely. Not the careful crack she'd seen before, but the whole wall coming down at once. 20 years of it, and what stood behind the wall was grief. Plain old, Unhealed grief, he said. Told me what I suspected. He sat down heavily on the second bucket, the one she'd been using to hold spare tools, and put his head in his hands for a long moment before he found the words. I was 18 working him, under Caleb, the season it happened. He'd found something in the estate book, sis. Wouldn't say what, not to me, only that it wasn't right, and he meant to see it made right. He went to speak to the steward one evening in early autumn. The elder Kellerman, Josiah's father, and he never came back to the pens again. Samuel's voice had gone rough. I waited 3 days before anyone would tell me anything. And what they told me was he'd left the parish. Sudden-like. No goodbye, no notice. Which wasn't like him at all, Eleanor. A man who kept ledgers the way he kept ledgers doesn't vanish without a word. But I was 18. And frightened. And nobody with any power in this parish wanted the question asked twice. So you never asked it, I asked it once. He looked up at her and his eyes were wet now, unashamed of it, to the elder Kellerman himself. Boy's foolishness, I suppose, or maybe just grief looking for somewhere to put itself. He told me to mind my own trade and be glad I still had one to mind. I understood him well enough. Eleanor reached over and put her hand on his arm. 20 years, she said quietly. 20 years, he agreed, and I've hated myself every one of them for not asking louder. They did not go to the magistrate that first night. Because a magistrate, Samuel pointed out, grimly practical even in his grief, was a man appointed by the very estate whose steward's family stood accused. And an accusation without proof, made by a penniless young woman and a village wheelwright against a family that had held the steward's office for 2 generations, would be laughed out of the room before it was half finished. Worse than laughed out. It would be a warning shot fired straight back at them, giving Josiah Kellerman every reason in the world to make certain whatever remained in that ground never saw daylight at all. We need more than bone, Samuel said. We need proof that reaches him directly, something with Hesna's hand on it. The second ledger, Eleanor said, slowly. You know of it? I don't know it exists, I suspect it. She thought of the way Kellerman's hand had trembled faintly, the day she signed her name in his office. The way he had not slept easy since, if the shadows under his eyes at the last quarter-day meeting were anything to judge by. A man who sells a flock worth what this one is worth for a single shilling isn't simply careless, Samuel. He's hiding something. And a steward hides financial sins in one place, his books. His locked drawer most like. Which we cannot simply get into his office and open. They sat with that a long while. The fire in Agnes' hearth burning low, the tin box and the sprig of pressed heather sitting on the table between them like a silent third party to the conversation. There's another way, Samuel said finally. Which is Pruitt. Eleanor blinked. The wolf factor? He's coming back within the fortnight. For the full clip once shearing's done, a man like that, a man who's built his whole trade on knowing where good wool comes from and where it's been quietly sold off cheap, he'll have contacts. In Bradford, in the wool societies. Men who keep records of who's bred what flock going back generations because good bloodlines are worth tracking the way good horses are. He leaned forward. If Caleb's flock was known before it went quiet, if there's any record anywhere outside this parish of what he built, and when it stopped being reported, that's a thread pulling from outside Kellerman's reach entirely. Something he can't simply spare a second time. Eleanor felt something click into place. Cold and clear, the clerk, she said suddenly. The vicar mentioned once weeks back a diocesan clerk, who'd taken interest in old wool society records. Said Caleb's hand looked familiar to him. I dismissed it at the time. I had 94 animals half dead in a field and no time to chase a stray remark. You have time now. I have very little time now, Eleanor said grimly. That's rather the trouble. Edmund Caldwell learned of the discovery within 2 days. He always learned things within 2 days. It was, if he was honest with himself, and Edmund Caldwell prided himself, above nearly everything else, on a certain private honesty he did not extend to the rest of the world, the single skill that had built his father's modest, holding into the considerably larger one he now stood to inherit whole. He learned it from his own steward, who had heard it from a laborer, who had heard it from Agnes's neighbor, who had apparently seen Samuel Grigg's face when he came down from the pens that evening and correctly judged, from the particular grey pallor of it, that something considerably worse than a lost sheep had been found up on that hill. Caldwell sat in his study with the news settling slowly through him, and felt for the first time in longer than he cared to examine something close to fear, because he had known, not everything, not the particulars, but he had been a young man of 25 when Caleb Renshaw disappeared, already managing his father's efforts, already learning the delicate art of profitable silence that his father practiced so effortlessly with the neighboring estate's steward. He remembered the elder Kellerman coming to his father's study one evening, agitated in a way Caldwell had never seen the man before or since. He remembered being sent from the room. He remembered afterward his father's peculiar quiet for the better part of a week. He had never asked what was said in that room. He had told himself at 25 that it was simply not his business, that the affairs of the Ravensmoor estate steward were the Ravensmoor estate's own concern, and a neighboring landowner's son did well to mind his own hedges and leave his neighbors alone. He understood now at 45 exactly what kind of coward that story had let him be, which was perhaps why his offer to buy Eleanor Whitfield's flock had come so quickly and so generous. Once word of its true worth reached him. Not merely opportunity. Something closer, if he examined it honestly, to a wish to make the whole uncomfortable business disappear beneath his own ownership, quietly, the way his father had once made an uncomfortable evening disappear beneath 20 years of unbroken silence. He had wanted the flock. He realized now, sitting in his study with his own hands gone cold, that some smaller and more honest part of him had wanted the truth to disappear along with it. He was ashamed of that. The shame surprised him. He had not expected at 45 to discover a part of himself capable of surprising him still. He went to Smugrigsert the following morning. Not to the pens. Not to Eleanor directly. Not yet. Some instinct told him she would receive him with rather less patience than the wheelwright might. Give what she now knew and what part, however small and cowardly, his own family's silence had played in allowing it to remain buried so long. Samuel looked up from the workbench, a half-shaped wheel spoke, still in his hand, and did not bother to hide his surprise. Mr. Caldwell Grigg. Caldwell stood in the doorway a moment, hat in hand, feeling for perhaps the first time in his adult life, entirely at a loss for how to begin a conversation. I heard what was found at the pens.
Word travels.
It does. Caldwell stepped inside out of the morning chill. I want you to know I had no part in it. Whatever happened 20 years back. I was young and my father, your father, knew it was not a question. Samuel set down the spoke entirely now, and the small forge fire at the back of the yard crackled in the silence that followed, and Caldwell found he could not in fact deny it. My father knew something, he said carefully. I never learned what. I was sent from the room whenever the elder Kellerman came to call. I've spent 20 years telling myself that not knowing meant I bore no part of it. And now? Now I think not knowing was its own kind of choosing. Caldwell's jaw tightened. I want to help set it right, Grigg, whatever that costs me. Samuel studied him a long moment. The way a man studies a tool he's not certain is trustworthy yet, testing its weight before he commits to using it. Miss Whitfield's the one you'll need to convince of that, he said finally. Not me, I intend to. Then you'd best mean it, Samuel said. Because that woman has buried a man's bones back under honest ground with her own 2 hands, and sat vigil beside them without sleeping proper for 2 nights running, and I'll not stand by and watch anyone use her grief for their own comfort. Whatever guilt you're carrying, Mr. Caldwell, you settle it honest, or you don't settle it here. Caldwell nodded slowly. Honest then, he said. I give you my word on it. Waiting for Fenn's arrival was in some ways harder than Essing's storm had been. Because a storm asks for action. A storm gives you something to do with your hands, your fear, your whole racing body, and the doing of it carries you through until morning. Waiting asks for nothing but stillness, and stillness, Eleanor was discovering, was a far crueler companion than any wind off the moor. She kept working the flock in those 11 days, because the flock did not care what was buried beneath it, or what letters were traveling toward Ravensmoor Hollow, from a diocesan archive 2 counties distant. The ewes needed worming. 2 had gone lame and needed their hooves pared and dressed. A fox had seen along the eastern hedge, bold in the way foxes only grow bold when lambs are near, and Eleanor and Samuel took turns walking the perimeter after dark with the dog ranging ahead of them, driving the animal off before it could work up the courage to try its luck. She found in the routine of it a kind of anchor. The work did not stop simply because the world underneath the work had cracked open. If anything, she leaned into it harder, the way a person leans into a task they can control when everything else has slipped entirely out of their hands. Samuel noticed. Of course he noticed. He noticed everything in his quiet, watchful way, and said nothing about it directly, only made certain, each of those 11 days, that he arrived early and left late, and that the silences between them, when they came, felt less like distance and more like company. You're not sleeping, he said. On the 9th day, not a question. No, nor am I, he admitted. Keep thinking on that boy I was. 18 and frightened and saying nothing. Wondering what he'd think of the man I turned into, waiting 20 years to finally say it out loud. He'd be glad, Eleanor said, that the man finally said it at all. Better 20 years late than never. Samuel was quiet a long moment, working a knot out of a length of rope with his blunt, careful fingers. I hope you're right, he said. I've hoped it every day since the ground gave him up. I'll go on hoping it, I expect, whatever the magistrate decides. The clerk's name was Mr. Aldous Fenn, and he arrived at Ravensmoor Hollow 11 days later in a hired trap, a leather satchel of papers clutched against his chest as though it contained something considerably more precious than parchment and ink. Eleanor met him at the shed, the shorn wool stacked and rolled around them in neat bales that told, in their own quiet way, the story of everything she had accomplished in these past 2 months. 43 bales, more coming from the last of the flock still being sheared. A fortune, by any reasonable estimate, sitting in a shed that had been half-collapsed rubble when she'd first laid eyes on it. He looked, first weary from the road, his coat still dusted with the chalk of 2 counties' worth of turnpike, and Eleanor found herself, despite the gravity of everything, offering him tea and a chair before a single word of business passed between them, because her uncle had taught her that a man ought to be given a moment to become a man again before he was asked to become useful. Fenn accepted the tea gratefully, drank half of it in one long unhurried swallow, then set the cup down and reached for his satchel, and something in his manner changed entirely. The weariness thus salting away, replaced by the particular alertness of a man about to do the one piece of work he had spent his whole quiet career waiting for the chance to do. Fenn did not look at the wool. He looked, instead, at the book she unwrapped for him on the plank table, Caleb Renshaw's careful, patient record, 20 years of breeding notes ending mid-sentence on a page that still, even now, made Eleanor's throat tighten every time she turned to it. He turned the pages with the particular reverence of a man handling something he had apparently spent years hoping to find. I know this hand, he said quietly. You're certain? Entirely certain. Caleb Renshaw corresponded with the Northern Wool Society for the better part of 15 years. I've read letters myself in the diocesan archive. His interests overlapped with the churchman's study of estate wool records, which is how they came to be preserved at all. He wrote of a breeding line he believed unmatched anywhere in the county. Fenn looked up, his eyes bright behind small spectacles. The society believed the line extinguished. His correspondence simply stopped. No explanation given. It was assumed over time that he had lost interest, or died of natural causes, or simply moved on to other work, the way men sometimes do. He did not move on, Eleanor said quietly. Fenn's face went grave. I understand you found remains. I did, and you believe them to be his. I have no doubt of it, Eleanor said. The mark he carved into the post above where he was buried is the same mark of flyleaf of this. He wanted someone to find both together, I think. Or he simply ran out of time to hide his work anywhere better. Fenn was quiet a long moment, his hand resting flat against the old leather cover, and when he spoke again his voice had thickened with something that sounded, to Eleanor's ear, remarkably like grief for a man he had never met. I have his letters, he said. The society kept them all these years, hoping for some word of what became of him. If those letters, and this book, and what you've found in the ground all point the same direction, that is not merely a local matter any longer, Miss Whitfield. That is a matter the diocese, and quite possibly the county magistrate, will be obliged to take seriously. A respected correspondent of a recognized wool society does not simply vanish from a parish without inquiry, not once the question is properly raised. It's being properly raised now, Eleanor said. Fenn looked at her for a long moment. Yes, he said slowly. I rather think it is. Josiah Kellerman burned the second ledger on a Wednesday night. He had told himself for 2 weeks that he would do it. Had told himself every single night since the bone had been found, that the honest ledger was the only one that need survive an inquiry, that a fire in his own hearth, in his own home, late at night when no one would ever think to ask what a steward burned in the privacy of his own study, would be the end of it, would settle the whole terrible weight he had carried since he was 19 years old, and said nothing while his father asked a dead man's question and got a dead man's silence in return. He held the ledger over the flame, and could not in the end let it drop, because he understood, standing there, his hand trembling, the fire's heat already singeing the corner of the cover, that burning the ledger would not undo the fact that he knew, that he had known for 20 years. That the fire could destroy the paper, but not the 19-year-old boy inside him who had watched his father commit murder by omission, by silence, by simply letting a shepherd's questions go unanswered until the shepherd himself went unanswered permanently. He lowered the ledger, sat down heavily at his desk, the fire still burning low and useless in the hearth, and for the first time in 20 years Josiah Kellerman wept. Not for himself. He was honest enough in that private moment to know it wasn't entirely for himself. For Caleb Renshaw, whom he had barely known, who had asked for nothing more than honesty and been given a grave instead. For his own father, who had died 11 years ago, still carrying whatever he'd done, and had never once, not in his final illnesses, not in his last confused hours, spoken a word of confession that might have let his son set the whole matter right, while there was still time to do it cleanly. And for himself, too. For 20 years of a life built on top of a silence he had never chosen, exactly, but had never once refused either. He sat with the ledger in his lap until the fire burned itself out entirely, and when the first gray light of dawn began to show at his study window, Josiah Kellerman had made a decision that would, within the week, upend everything the parish of Ravensmoor Hollow believed it understood about itself. He would not burn the ledger. He would bring it himself to Eleanor Whitfield. He came to the pens at first light, on foot, without his usual air of narrow-eyed authority, carrying a leather satchel pressed close against his chest the way Fenn had carried his own papers days before. Eleanor was at the trough when she saw him coming up the lane, and every instinct in her body went taut and wary at once. Seized Samuel, straightened slowly, his hand drifting, almost unconsciously, toward the fork leaning against the hurdle. Kellerman stopped at a respectful distance. Did not come closer than the rail, Miss Whitfield, Mr. Kellerman. I've come to give you something. His voice was not the voice she remembered from his office, sharp and certain over his ledger. This voice shook faintly at the edges. I should have brought it 20s ago. I was a coward then. I find I cannot afford to be one any longer. He held out the satchel. Eleanor did not move to take it. What is it? My father's second ledger, Kellerman said. 22 years of falsified accounts. Wool receipts adjusted, sales underreported. Money skimmed, a little here, a little there. Small enough that no auditor from London ever thought twice about it. He swallowed hard. And an entry, dated the autumn Caleb Renshaw disappeared, showing a payment made from the estate accounts to a man my father never named in the book by anything but initials. A payment for what he called, in his own hand, a matter requiring discretion. The yard had gone entirely silent. Even the dog had gone still, ears pricked, sensing the weight of the moment the way animals sense a storm, before the sky shows any sign of. You knew, Eleanor said. Quiet, deadly quiet. I suspected, Kellerman said. For 20 years I suspected, and did nothing, because doing something meant admitting what my own silence had cost. I am not asking your forgiveness, Miss Whitfield. I don't believe I've earned the right to ask for it. I am asking only that you take this to whoever needs to see it. The magistrate, the diocese. Whoever can finally set this right. His voice broke just slightly on the last words. Caleb Renshaw deserved better than 20 years of silence. So did you, coming into this parish and finding what you found without a single soul warning you what you might be walking into. Eleanor took the satchel. Her hands, as she noted distantly, were steady. Steadier than she'd expected them to be. Why now, she said. Why not the day I found him? Because I am a coward, Kellerman said simply. Cowardice, I have learned this past fortnight, does not cure itself on its own. It cures itself. If it cures itself at all, only when the cost of staying silent finally outweighs the cost of speaking. He met her eyes directly, for what she realized was perhaps the first time since she'd walked into his office 2 months ago. You made that true, Miss Whitfield. Whatever else comes of this. You made silence cost more than truth finally, after 20 years of it costing nothing at all. He turned and walked back down the lane without waiting for a response. Eleanor stood at the rail with the satchel in her hands and the whole weight of 20 years finally beginning to shift. The confrontation, when it came in the open. Not in a magistrate's chamber, not in a locked estate office where a powerful man's word might still somehow outweigh a poor woman's evidence. Eleanor had thought carefully about this. In the days after Kellerman handed her the ledger, and had concluded, with Samuel's grim agreement and Fenn's cautious approval, that the truth needed daylight and witnesses in equal measure if it was to survive the telling. Market day. The whole parish gathered, as it always gathered, in the square before the church, stalls and carts and the ordinary business of buying and selling laid out around them, and above it all, unusually, the presence of Lord Ravensmoor's own carriage, summoned by careful, deliberate letter a week in advance, requesting his lordship's attendance on a matter concerning the estate's honor that could not, Eleanor had written, wait for a quieter hour. He had come curious perhaps, or simply unwilling to be seen refusing a request phrased in exactly those terms. Eleanor stood at the center of the square with the tin box in one hand and the second ledger in the other, Samuel at her shoulder, Fenn beside him with his satchel of preserved letters, and felt the whole weight of the gathered parish's attention settle onto her, like a physical thing. She had rehearsed nothing. She spoke anyway, and found the words came steady once she started, the way water finds its own level once a dam finally breaks. 2 months ago, she said, her voice carrying clear across the square. I bought 93 ewes and a ram for a shilling. This parish laughed at me for it. Some of you are standing here now who laughed loudest. A ripple moved through the crowd. Squire Harding, near the front, went visibly rigid. What none of you knew, Eleanor continued, what I did not know myself, not at first, was that those sheep were never ruined at all. They were the life's work of a man named Caleb Renshaw. 20 years of patient, careful breeding, producing wool finer than anything a Bradford factor had handled in 11 years of trade. A flock this parish's own steward sold off for nothing because its true worth threatened to expose something he had spent 2 decades helping to bury. She held up the ledger. This is proof of 22 years of falsified accounts, kept by the elder Mr. Kellerman, and continued, in silence if not in ink by. And this, she set the tin box down on the market stall beside her, opened it, laid the pressed sprig of heather and the scrap of blue thread on top of the old leather book for every eye in the square to see. This is what I found buried in the ground beside a shepherd's own grave. A grave dug and hidden by men in this parish who valued their own comfort over one honest man's life. The square had gone entirely, utterly silent. Caleb Renshaw discovered the fraud himself, Eleanor said. 20 years ago. He went to confront the steward about it quietly, honestly, asking only that it stop, and he was murdered for the asking. Buried beneath his own shepherd's shelter, not 50 yards from the flock he'd spent his whole life building, and left there while this parish told itself a comfortable story about a man who simply wandered off one autumn, without so much as a farewell. Josiah Kellerman stood near the church steps, his face gray, his hands clasped white-knuckled in front of him. He did not deny a single word of it. Lord Ravensmoor stepped forward from beside his carriage, his expression unreadable, and the crowd parted for him without needing to be asked. Miss Whitfield, he said. You're certain of this? I have his remains, my lord. I have his own careful hand, 20 years of it, recording every single breeding of every single ewe in that flock. I have his correspondence with the Northern Wool Society, preserved by the diocese, confirming the very existence of a line the society believed lost entirely, and I have a ledger, in your own steward's family's hand, recording a payment for discretion dated the exact autumn Josiah disappeared from this parish. She let the silence stretch. I am certain of all of it, my lord, she said. As certain as I have been of anything in my life. It was Kellerman who broke first. Not under Lord Ravensmoor's direct questioning, though that questioning came, sharp and formal, right there in the square before every soul in Ravensmoor Hollow had gathered to witness it. It was something smaller in the end that finally cracked the last of Josiah Kellerman's carefully maintained composure. It was the sight of Samuel Grigg's face. Standing there among the crowd, a man Kellerman had known his whole life, quiet and solid and entirely unsurprised by any of it, because Samuel, of course, had suspected all along. Had carried his own 18-year-old grief silently for 2 decades, the way Kellerman himself had carried his father's sin. 2 men, both robbed of 20 years by the same silence. Kellerman stepped forward before his lordship had finished his second question. It's true, he said, loud enough for the whole square to hear, his voice cracking on the words in a way that made even Squire Harding go quiet until, all of it. My father killed Caleb Renshaw. I did not strike the blow myself. I was 19 years old. And I did not learn the full truth of what had happened until years afterward, piecing it together from things my father let slip in his final illness. But I knew enough, long before that, to understand that something was deeply wrong. And I said nothing. For 20 years I said nothing, because saying something meant admitting my own father was a murderer. And admitting that meant losing everything my family had built on top of his silence. He looked directly at Eleanor. I sold you that flock for a shilling, he said. Because I hoped, God forgive me, that a ruined flock in the hands of a penniless young woman would simply fade quietly away, that the last evidence of what my father had done would rot in a field the way it had rotted in the ground for 20 years already, and no one would ever think to look closely enough to find what you found. You cut my fence, Eleanor said, quiet, certain. Kellerman's face crumpled. I did not do it myself, he said. I paid a man from beyond the parish to do it. I told myself it was only meant to scatter the flock, to cost you time and money, to discourage you into selling before Caldwell's offer or for someone else's. I told myself no animal would come to serious harm. I have thought of little else since that night, but how close I came to being responsible for far worse than I already was. Lord Ravensmoor's expression had gone from unreadable to something considerably colder.
Mr.
He said, you will surrender yourself to the parish constable this hour. Your family's steward of this estate ends today, and every finding of this inquiry will be forwarded to the county magistrate for full and proper prosecution. Yes, my lord. And you will tell me, his lordship continued, his voice dropping into something quieter, and somehow more terrible for the quiet, exactly where the man responsible for the original murder is buried himself, because I do not believe, Mr. Kellerman, that your father acted entirely alone that night, and I intend to know the whole of it, every name, before this day is finished. Kellerman nodded, defeated entirely now, the last of 20 years' careful posture gone out of him completely. There's one other name, my lord, he said quietly. I've carried it as long as I've carried the rest. The square held its breath. My father did not act alone, Kellerman said. He could not have. Moving a body. Digging a grave deep enough to escape casual notice, close enough to the pens that the ground would settle naturally under years of foot traffic. That is not work one frightened man does by himself in a single autumn night. Who, his lordship said, flat final. Kellerman's eyes moved slowly across the gathered crowd and settled at last on a face near the back of the square. An old face, weathered by decades of outdoor labor, and Eleanor realized with a jolt that ran clean through her entire body, entirely terribly familiar. The old grave Amos Vane. A man who had held the position for as long as anyone in the parish could remember, quiet and reliable and entirely unremarkable. The sort of man whose presence at every burial in the churchyard for 40 years had made him so ordinary a fixture that no one had ever thought to wonder what else exactly his particular skills might have been useful for. Amos Vane went very pale. I was young, he said, before anyone had even accused him directly, the words tumbling out of him in a rush, as though 20 years of pressure had simply been waiting all this time for the smallest crack to release through. The elder Kellerman came to me in the dead of that night. Said there'd been an accident. Said the shepherd had fallen, struck his head, died of it before anyone could fetch help, and that word getting out would only bring trouble down on an estate that had already buried enough grief for 1 year. What with the young lord's own mother having passed only months before. You believe that, Eleanor said. Her voice shook despite every effort to keep it steady. An accident. I wanted to believe it, Amos Vane said, and his voice broke entirely now. An old man's cracking under a weight he had carried since he was young enough to still believe such careful lies. I've told myself that story for 20 years, Miss Whitfield. I dug the grave, I helped move him. And every single year since, on the anniversary of that night, I've stood over my own honest graves in the churchyard and told myself I did nothing wrong, because I never struck the blow, and because I made myself believe that it truly had been an accident. And now, his lordship asked, quiet, terrible. Amos Vane looked finally directly at Eleanor. Now I look at what she's done, he said. Kneeling in that ground for weeks, uncovering what I helped bury, giving that man back his name after 20 years of letting it rot in silence alongside his body. And I cannot tell myself the comfortable story any longer. I saw the wound on him, my lord. I saw it that night, and I have known every single day since exactly what kind of wound a fall does not make. The constable took both men before the sun had fully set that same Edmund Caldwell, watching from the edge of the square where he'd stood the entire proceeding in grim, guilty silence, stepped forward once the crowd had begun, slowly, to disperse into knots of stunned, murmuring conversation that would, Eleanor suspected, occupy every hearth in Ravensmoor Hollow for weeks to come. Miss Whitfield. She turned to face him, still holding the tin box, still feeling the whole weight of the afternoon settling slowly into her bones. I owe you an apology, Caldwell said, for the offer I made, and for the reasons behind it that I did not have the courage to examine honestly until this past fortnight. I knew more than I let myself know for longer than I'd like to admit. I am ashamed of that. You told Samuel you wanted to help set it right, Eleanor said. Whatever it cost you, I did. Then help, Eleanor said simply. There will be a great deal of setting right left to do. Once the dust of this afternoon settles, Caleb Renshaw deserves a proper burial. A proper marker. Seeing more than 20 years of silence and a scratched arrow on a rotting post, Caldwell nodded slowly. I would consider it an honor, he said, to contribute whatever's needed. Land, if it comes to that, a stonemason. Whatever this parish requires to give that man the recognition it should have given him 20 years ago. Lord Ravensmoor summoned Eleanor to the estate house 3 days later. She walked up the long gravel drive she had once seen only from a distance, on that first grey morning when she'd arrived in Ravensmoor Hollow with nothing but a split boot and a dead father's debts, and found herself for the first time in this entire strange, terrible, extraordinary season entirely uncertain what to expect. He received her in a study lined floor to ceiling with old estate ledgers, honest ones, she noted, or at least she had no particular reason to doubt, and did not waste time on pleasantries. Miss Whitfield, he said, I have spent 3 days reviewing everything you brought before this parish. The letters from the diocesan clerk, the testimony of Mr. Kellerman and Mr. Vane, both now in the county's custody awaiting for charge. He paused. I owe you a debt I am not entirely certain how to repay. You owe me nothing, my lord. I owe you a great deal, he said. My own family's steward, serving under my own family's name, murdered a man on this estate's ground and buried the truth of it for 20 years. That is not a small thing to have happened under a family's watch, however unknowing that watch may have been. I do not intend to let it go unanswered. He rose, walked to the window, looking out over the same long grey rise of grazing land Eleanor had first seen from the hill above the village 2 months ago now, though it felt, standing here, like a different lifetime entirely. I am granting you permanent title to the pasture, he said. The pens, the grazing rights, the land itself, in perpetuity, free of any lease or rent. It is the least this family can offer, given what was done on it, and given what you have built there despite everything that was done. Eleanor's breath caught. My lord, there is more, he continued, before she could finish. I intend to commission a proper memorial stone, at my own expense, to be placed at the site where Caleb Renshaw's remains were found. His name, the years of his service, a record permanent and public of exactly what he built on this ground and exactly what was done to silence him for it. He turned back to face her. I would like your input on the inscription, Miss Whitfield, if you're willing to give it. You knew his work in the better than any soul living, better, I suspect, than I ever will. Eleanor felt her throat close entirely. I would be honored, my lord. In the days between the reckoning in the square and the memorial itself, Ravensmoor Hollow did the slow, quiet work that villages do after an old wound has finally been lanced. Not healing exactly, not yet, but the necessary bleeding that has to happen before healing can properly begin. Eleanor found herself, more than once, simply standing at the rail in the early morning, watching the flock graze, and feeling the strange, unfamiliar sensation of having nothing urgent left to fight. The fence was mended and would stay mended because Lord Ravensmoor had sent 2 of his own laborers to reinforce every hurdle on the property at his own expense. A small gesture, he had said, but one he insisted upon. The wool was sold, the coin banked, the debts to Samuel and to Agnes and to every soul who had lent a hand settled in full, with interest neither of them had asked for, and both of them had quietly refused until Eleanor insisted harder than they did. The old sheepdog had begun in those quiet days to slow down properly for the first time since Eleanor had known him. He still came to the gate each morning. He still walked the perimeter at her side. But he napped longer now, in the thin sun, and Eleanor found herself watching him with a tenderness that surprised her. The particular ache of loving something you know, somewhere in your chest, you will not have forever. He's earned his rest, Samuel said once, catching her watching the dog doze against the hurdle, more than most men I know. He waited a long time for someone to come back for this flock, Eleanor said. I think he simply hadn't decided yet whether I'd stay long enough to be worth trusting in now? Now I think he's decided. He came to the pens on a Sunday without the spaniel this time, and without the particular swagger Eleanor had come to associate with him, since that very first cold morning in the lane. He stood at the rail a long moment before speaking, watching the flock graze quiet in the late spring sun, clean now every single one of them, their fleece grown back thick and even and pale, the way Caleb Renshaw had spent 20 years teaching this ground to produce. I spoke hastily, he said finally. That first morning in the lane. You did, Eleanor agreed. I've thought on it a great deal since. What I said, and why I said it, and what kind of man finds satisfaction in another person's ruin before he's troubled himself to learn a single true thing about their circumstances. He shook his head slowly. I am not proud of the answer I've come to. No, Eleanor said. Not unkindly, I shouldn't think you would be. I'd like to buy a ram lamb from you, Harding said, when you've one to spare. At whatever price you name. Not because I need it particularly. Because I'd like some small part of what you've built here, and I'd like to have earned it honestly, for once, instead of simply assuming the world owed me whatever I chose to reach for. Eleanor studied him a long moment. I'll think on it, she said. It was, she reflected afterward, very nearly the same answer Caleb Renshaw's flock had given the whole of Ravensmoor Hollow, in its own quiet way. From the very first morning she'd knelt at that rail and looked past the ruin to what lay beneath it. Not forgiveness exactly, not yet, but not a closed door either. They held the ceremony on a bright morning in late September, the light coming low and gold across the slope exactly the way it had come, Eleanor thought. On the very first evening she'd truly understood what she'd found on this ground. The whole parish came. Even those who had laughed loudest months ago in the lane outside the Fox and Crown. Even Squire Harding, standing near the back with his hat in his hands, quiet and appropriately humbled. Even Edmund Caldwell, who had, true to his word, funded the stonemason's work entirely and stood now beside the finished marker, with an expression Eleanor could only describe as genuine grief for a man he had never known. The stone was simple. White granite, cut clean, set at the exact spot where the old shepherd's shelter had once stood against the corner post. Shaw, shepherd of this ground, 1816, 2836. His work outlasted his silence. His name is spoken now and will not be forgotten again. Eleanor had chosen the words herself, working late into 3 separate nights with Fenn's careful guidance on the wording. Until they felt right. Until they felt true. Lord Ravensmoor spoke first. Brief, formal, an apology on behalf of his family that Eleanor sensed cost him a great deal more than the stone itself had. Then Samuel spoke haltingly, of a boy of 18 who had loved a quiet, careful shepherd the way a son loves a father he chooses rather than one he's given, and who had carried that love and that grief silently for 20 years too long. Then it was Eleanor's turn. She stood at the marker with the tin box in her hands. She had decided, in the end, that it belonged here now, buried properly beneath the stone rather than kept as a relic, and looked out over the flock grazing quiet on the slope below. I did not know this man, she said. I never once heard his voice or saw his face or shook his hand. Everything I know of Caleb Renshaw, I learned from what his hands left behind. A book of careful notes, a scrap of blue thread. A flock that outlasted everything done to ruin it, because whatever he built into these animals he built it to last. She paused, let the silence settle. I think that's the truest thing I can say of any of us, she continued. That the work of our hands outlasts the silence of our mouths. That what we build carefully, honestly, over years no one is watching, that outlasts every lie told about it afterward. This parish called these sheep worthless. Called me foolish for buying them. And the whole time, buried in the ground beneath our feet, was proof that worth doesn't disappear simply because no one's troubled themselves to look for it. She knelt. Set the tin box gently into the small prepared space at the base of the stone. Rest now, she said quietly, just for him. Just for Caleb Renshaw. 20 years silent finally. Properly heard. Your work is safe, your name is spoken, and it will not be forgotten again. Afterward the parish did what parishes do, it gathered. Not at the church this time, but back at the pens themselves. Because Agnes had insisted days before that a man's deserved more than a solemn stone and a solemn hour. He deserved a table and food, and voices raised in something other than grief. So tables were carried up from the village square and set along the low side of the pasture, and every household that could spare it brought what it could. Bread. Cold mutton. A dented urn of tea kept hot over a small fire. Winifred's niece brought a cake she had clearly worried over for 2 days, and set it down with the particular pride of someone who wanted, badly, to be part of setting something right. Squire Harding came and ate standing near the edge of things and did not try to make himself the center of any conversation, which was for him its own kind of penance. Mr. Fenn stayed the whole afternoon, walking slowly among the cleaned and shorn flock, with his hands clasped behind his back, occasionally consulting a small notebook of his own. Already, Eleanor suspected, drafting the account he would carry back to the diocese and the Northern Wool Society, so that Caleb Renshaw's name might finally take its rightful place in whatever record such men kept of one another's quiet, extraordinary work. Edmund Caldwell brought his own steward, a younger, plainer man than the one who had served him before, and introduced him to Eleanor with an odd formality, as though he wanted it noted publicly that this new man had been chosen for honesty rather than convenience. Eleanor moved through the gathering slowly, accepting condolences that were, in truth, congratulations, wearing a quieter coat, and found that she did not mind the attention nearly so much as she had once minded the mockery. Being seen, she was discovering, was not the same thing as being judged. It had simply taken the parish a long hard season to learn the difference, and it had taken her just as long to stop flinching from either one. By the time the last of the mourners had drifted back down the lane toward the village, the light had gone fully gold, the way it does in late September, when summer hasn't quite let go and autumn hasn't quite arrived, and the whole world seems to hang briefly, in a kind of grateful pause. Eleanor stood alone at the rail. Samuel a few respectful paces off, the old sheep, grayer now, slower, but still faithfully present, lying warm against her boot. She looked out over the flock, 95 now, counting the lamb born in the storm, grazing quiet and clean on land that finally properly belonged to her, deeded permanent, free of any debt or lease, that might one day be used to take it away again. He waited 20 years, she said quietly, for someone willing to kneel in the mud and look closely enough to find him. Samuel came to stand beside her at the rail and said nothing for a long while, which was, as always, its own kind of answer. Then he nodded once toward the slope, toward the grazing flock, toward the whole gold evening settling slow and warm over the parish below. There's more in a beast, Eleanor said, half to herself, half to the dog, half to the wide evening light, than what's been done to it. The dog thumped his tail once against the straw, and somewhere below them, in the fold of the valley, the village lit its first evening lamps, and the flock grazed on quiet, clean, and whole, exactly as Caleb Renshaw had always known, in his own patient, careful heart, that they could be.